Welcome to meeting number 9 of the House of Commons Special Committee on the Canada-People's Republic of China relationship. Pursuant to the order of reference of May 16, 2022, the committee is meeting on its study of the Canada-People's Republic of China relations with a focus on the Canada-Taiwan relations for the first hour and a focus on the exposure of Canadian investment funds to Chinese equities and bonds linked to human rights violation for the second and third hour. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of June 23, 2022. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. A few comments to lead for the benefit of the witnesses and members. Please wait till I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you're not speaking. I think everybody on Zoom has received the test and all of the instructions, but you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French for interpretation. And for those in the room, of course, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use the raised hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can, and we appreciate your patience and understanding in this regard. And in accordance with the committee's routine motion concerning connection tests for witnesses, I can confirm that all of our virtual witnesses have had the test and are ready to go. I would like to welcome Ms. Matheson and Mr. Couric I'm sorry, Ms. Blaney. I knew that. But it's a long way down there. Okay. But thank you for filling in. And by the way, please pass on our best to Ms. McPherson, who's not well at all today. So do make sure she knows we're thinking of her. Now I'd like to welcome our witnesses for the first hour. From the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development, Paul Thoppel, Assistant Deputy Minister, Asia Pacific, Weldon Epp, Director General, Northeast Asia, and Jenny Chen, Executive Director, Greater China Political and Coordination. Two quick things. As you know, this panel was due to visit with us last week and at the last minute was unable to. Letters have been exchanged and explanations made, and I believe that those have been distributed to the committee. I'd also actually ask the committee's indulgence here because the topic matter that this panel is here to present to us is all about trade, and might be, in fact, a good crossover between the focus on Taiwan and the focus of the next study that we're doing on trade with China. So I would ask your indulgence in accepting questions and answers from this panel for use in the Taiwan study as well as the following study. And if everybody's in agreement with that, we will ask, I believe it's Mr. Epp, or you'll be making the opening comment? Oh, it is Mr. Thoppel. All right, very good, sir. 5 minutes or less.
Merci, Monsieur le.
Thank you, Chair, for this opportunity to address this committee on Canada's engagement with and concerning Taiwan.
First, offer my sincere regret for the unintended inconvenience to committee members last week due to technical difficulties both GAC officials experienced. After repeated unsuccessful attempts to connect, House of Commons IT advised that the appearance by officials via video conference could not proceed, although both officials remained on standby pending instructions or options at that time. I am here with the same officials this evening to answer your questions. Should the committee be interested, I would welcome an opportunity to also update you on my recent engagement at the 18th Annual Canada-Taiwan Economic Consultations in Taipei, where I was last week at the time of the committee hearing and where I met with various Taiwanese cabinet ministers. Depuis 1970, le Canada.
Since 1970, Canada has built significant cultural and economic ties with Taiwan, as well as people-to-people ties. Taiwan is an innovative, democratic, and globally connected society.
Taiwan is anchored in its One China policy, under which the government of Canada recognized the People's Republic of China as the sole legitimate government of China, taking note, neither challenging nor endorsing the Chinese government's position on Taiwan. Ce cadre a permis au Canada d'approfondir sa.
This framework has allowed Canada to deepen cooperation with Taiwan in areas such as renewable offshore wind energy, as well as in indigenous trade.
Whether it is maintaining semiconductor supply chains to support critical global industries or providing medical assistance and expertise towards fighting the COVID-19 pandemic, Taiwan has become an important stakeholder across a range of pressing issues of global concern. It is for this reason that Canada continues to support Taiwan's meaningful participation in international organizations, where there is a practical imperative and where Taiwan's absence would be detrimental to global interests. As you may know, Canada has a complementary and growing trade and economic relationship with Taiwan based on robust business-to-business ties, shared values, and significant science, technology, and innovation collaboration. Canada's ongoing economic consultations with Taiwan continue to be very productive, covering a broad range of topics such as agricultural market access, cooperation on Indigenous affairs, green economy, supply chain security, intellectual property policy dialogue, export controls, and education. Although Canada regained partial access to Taiwanese beef market in July 2016, we continue to advocate for greater Canadian market access for beef over 30 months of age. Canada remains gravely concerned about the events in August that led to a rapid escalation of tensions across the Taiwan Strait. In response to the PRC's live fire exercises and economic coercion following a visit by U.S. Speaker of the House of Representatives Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan on August the 2nd and the 3rd, Minister Joly and her G7 counterparts urged the PRC not to unilaterally change the status quo by force in the region and to resolve cross-strait differences by peaceful means. Canadian officials have also communicated directly to the Chinese embassy Canada's concerns in the region. En tant que démocratie de langue chinoise, Taiwan continued to fail.
As a Chinese-speaking democracy, Taiwan continues to make significant strides towards consolidating a dynamic and pluralistic society in which the rights and freedoms of women, the LGBTQ+ community, and Indigenous peoples are guaranteed by the rule of law. Within the parameters of its One China policy, Canada engages both sides of the Taiwan Strait to advance issues of common interest while maintaining respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms. This has informed the Canada's government approach to advancing its interests with and concerning Taiwan for over 5 decades. And this will serve as a basis for continued engagement into the future as well.
We move forward, Canada's recently released Indo-Pacific strategy will also contribute in shaping the development of our relationship with Taiwan. The strategy presents a comprehensive framework to deepen our presence and engagement in the region by increasing our contributions to regional peace and security. And finally, it will allow Canada to strengthen its position as an active, engaged, and reliable partner in the Indo-Pacific, including Taiwan. Thank you. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much. I hope we brought our suntan lotion here. All right, we will go to our first round of questioning, and for that we'll go to Mr. Chong for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for coming today to testify in person. We appreciate that greatly. In the Indo-Pacific strategy, the government says that, quote, we will challenge China, end quote, when it comes to China's belligerence and threatening behavior in the region. And so you mentioned, as we noted, that Minister Joly spoke up publicly when China increased its military aggression toward Taiwan around the visit of Speaker Pelosi. So my question is there a process in place in the department to assess when the government of Canada is going to speak up to challenge China on this kind of behavior, or is it more of a situation-by-situation assessment?
Thank you, Chair, for the question. I think the framework that's been outlined in the Indo-Pacific strategy is quite clear, and it provides the guidance for us to be proactive in terms of providing guidance to Minister and the Government of Canada in terms of responding to events in a much more proactive way based on what is agreed framework. So I think what you will see, Mr. Chair, is more recommendations where China is contravening the international rules-based order.
Okay. So there is a process that the department has put in place to make those assessments, to provide advice to the minister in future situations. Okay, thank you. The review also mentions, the strategy also mentions that the Government of Canada is reviewing all mechanisms and structures such as memorandums of understanding and dialogues with the People's Republic of China. So two very quick questions. How many of these do we have? I assume it's in the dozens. And between Canada and the People's Republic of China. And secondly, how long is this review of these memoranda and these dialogues expected to take?
Mr. Chair, I'm going to ask my colleague Weldon Epp to respond to that.
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. I don't have at my fingertips the actual number. You're right, it would be in the dozens of dialogues. We're talking about dialogues, MOUs, agreements. They're not all the same in terms of the mechanisms, the legal import, and sort of obligations under them. And so that review is underway. It's already begun. And so we will continue through a process led by GAC to work with partner departments to review them and bring them forward.
And will the department make any public announcement about when the review is complete?
Mr. Chair, I would say that's a question for which I don't have an answer because the review is underway. I think once we understand what the results of the review are, there will be opportunities, particularly because some of these do involve stakeholders, so they will have to be publicly discussed. I would just say the premise and the philosophy is everything's under review, but not everything reviewed will change or disappear.
Understood.
And so if there are changes, those would have to be communicated
My advice
publicly.
is that it would be good to have a deadline, because if there are no deadlines, things tend to drag on. I have a question with respect to Taiwan. Earlier this year, the Government of Canada announced that it intended to enter into negotiations on a foreign investment promotion and protection agreement. Where are those? Where are we at in the process? Have negotiations begun? When are they expected to begin? If they haven't, when are we expected to conclude such an agreement?
Mr. Chair, in response to that question, as we know, in January, Canada launched exploratory discussions with Taiwan on a foreign investment protection agreement. Those discussions have now been concluded, and now an assessment is underway as a result of those discussions. And what Minister Ng has conveyed to her Taiwanese counterpart is that a decision will be made soon and will be conveyed to him, as I said, soon.
Another quick question. As part of the new strategy, are there any plans for a minister of the Canadian government to visit Taiwan, as we saw with Minister Manley's visit some time ago to Taiwan?
Right now, I'm not apprised of a planning calendar whereby Canada's trade minister would go.
There's no current plans for a visit?
Not based on our current planning calendar. That being said, a ministerial visit will be dependent upon what is Canada's interests and that necessitate a ministerial trip.
When a new FIPA agreement is concluded, I think it would be appropriate for the relevant minister to sign the agreement in Taipei. That's just something to put on the table. Just a final quick question. Minister Joly mentioned that the Government of Canada would be deploying a new frigate, a third frigate, to the Pacific region as part of this strategy. Many defense analysts have pointed out that Canada doesn't have a resupply capacity of any sort in the Pacific region. As part of the ongoing defense review, is the government planning on bringing additional military and security resources to the region in addition to what's been outlined in the Indo-Pacific strategy?
A brief response, if you could, please.
Mr. Chair, I think that's a question that should be properly asked to the Department of National Defense officials, particularly in the context of the development of the defense policy update. The Indo-Pacific strategy has already been quite clear in terms of what is the military contribution, but I can't say more beyond that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chong. Now we'll go to Mr. Cormier for 6 minutes or less.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci aux.
Thank you, Chair. And I've had conversations with various businesses in my riding, and often they say, look, what does this beast eat? What is it really all about? This Indo-Pacific strategy, especially when I look at the goals of increasing trade, improving resilience of supply chains, etc. Could you sum up, perhaps in a minute or two, how Canadian business is going to be able to benefit from this strategy, which, as we know, is not a week-long strategy and not even a month-long. It's a strategy that takes years. So how can our Canadian companies benefit from this new strategy? If you could sum this up in a minute or two, because I do have other questions for you.
Thank you, Chair, for the question. I think we have to start with examining what is Canada's Asia exports. If you look at the flows as well as the FDI investments from that part of the world into Canada, it's dominated from certain countries. What the objective from this pillar of the strategy tries to achieve is ensuring expanded market access, diversification of trade flows, and therefore ensuring more predictability and reliability of those export streams. And particularly foreign direct investment from trusted partners going forward. And so what you will see is earnest efforts that have already been announced in terms of free trade negotiations with ASEAN, Indonesia, an early progress harvest agreement negotiations with India in order to send a signal to Canadian business about the opportunities with some of the more fastest growing economic growth regions in the world.
OK, parfait, merci. Écoutez, je parle encore plus au niveau de ma.
Thank you. And again, I'm talking about my riding because, as we know, when it comes to fisheries, we export a large number of our products, crab, lobster, etc., to China. One of the questions that comes up frequently is it's taken years to develop markets in China for these products. How many years is it going to take for us to develop another market for those products? Are you confident that we're going to be able to, in fact, diversify, the way you said, our markets towards these other countries? It's going to be lengthy work, of course, but are you sure that we're going to be able to benefit from these new openings?
Chair, I really want to thank the member for that really important question, because it's a question that I know Canadian businesses are asking based on the geopolitical environment that is changing. First of all, I should start off by indicating that the strategy does not indicate that Canadian business should suspend doing trade with China. It is quite clear that that business should engage and diversify within China, but also outside China. What Minister Joly was very clear is that Canadian business should take a wide eyes open approach to its engagement with China, given the unpredictability that Canadian business has witnessed in terms of trade flows with that country, as much other countries have also experienced unpredictability. But that is a risk assessment that each Canadian business must do. diversification of revenue flows by companies, it doesn't happen overnight. All government can do is, one, set the table in terms of frameworks for trade opportunities through free trade agreements and foreign investment protection agreements, as well as a focus on where trade promotion and business development dollars should be in order to help Canadian companies in terms of their marketing and their business development in order to achieve diversified revenue flows. That's why the government has been very clear in the Indo-Pacific strategy in terms of the creation of an Indo-Pacific trade representative, moving on modernized trade Team Canada missions, as well as the creation of a trade hub in terms of a gateway to Southeast Asia and the early progress trade agreement negotiations with India in order to capitalize on what the IMF executive director says is India and ASEAN as the two regions of the world that are experiencing the fastest economic growth rates. And we're trying to set the table in order to encourage Canadian business to try to at least increase our possibilities of success on diversification flow.
Parfait, merci. And like you said, like we should keep, doing business with China also. But how do you think China views Taiwan inclusion in the Indo-Pacific strategy, in your opinion?
So China has a one China principle, which is very different from Canada's one China policy. And their one China principle makes it clear that Taiwan is and should be reunited with mainland China. And therefore, they don't condone whether it's parliamentary visits to Taiwan or even my visit last week to Taiwan, because they believe that those actions are inconsistent for federal or ministerial visits to bestow the act of sovereignty to the state which they want to believe should be a province.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cormier. And we'll now go to Mr. Bergeron for 6 minutes or less.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here this evening. We missed you last week, so we're very happy to see you this evening. During a speech on last September 6th, President of Taiwan, Madame Tsai Ing-wen, accused the People's Republic of China of waging a cognitive war against Taiwan by spreading disinformation. According to a report of the Associated Press on September the 6th, this year, experts warned that People's Republic of China had made considerable inroads into Taiwan mass media and could spread fake news in social media. The Global Taiwan Institute, a political and research institute based in Washington, explains that the People's Republic of China's capacity to interfere in Taiwan elections has become more sophisticated and more aggressive. Without entering the debate on Chinese interference, I would like to ask you a question. What do we know about the steps taken by Taiwan to try to prevent this disinformation and this influence of the People's Republic of China in its internal affairs? And second question, what can Canada learn from the experience in Taiwan?
Mr. Chair, I think the member asked a very good question, and it was the subject of a discussion I had actually in Taiwan last week, which I'd like to share for the benefit of committee members. What they have done within their government is organize an independent party that has the capacity to respond to disinformation that comes from outside sources and respond through social media, through an app, to within 1 hour. And they have the capacity to do that, and they are monitoring. And the Taiwanese people are very much aware of this app and the responsiveness nature, and therefore the Taiwanese people don't necessarily, because of the degree of responsiveness and the timeliness, they have now been very akin to not necessarily taking on board what is, in a sense, the breaking news that may come from sort of source that may be propagating non-factual information. And so it's that degree of timeliness that the Taiwanese government believes has been very effective in making the people aware that they shouldn't take at first blush news items that come right away. But the key is the responsiveness and the 1 hour limit.
Sur la base de ce que vous avez eu comme échange et discussion avec vos vis-à-vis taïwanais,
Based on your conversations with your Taiwan counterparts, what can Canada learn from this experience? And how transposable is that experience to the situation here in Canada?
That's a very good question. I think as we look at the proliferation of non-facts, whether from external sources, from authoritarian states, or dare I say, even within domestic sources, we need to understand how should we ensure that the Canadian people receive, to ensure that they get those facts and get the right facts. And that's sort of, there are a number of ways to do that. There is the Taiwanese way with an independent party of the government with the capacity in order to move in some degree of alacrity and in a responsiveness manner. But there are a number of other ways in order to accomplish that. I'm just responding to your first question in terms of what the Taiwanese method is, but I don't think it's Global Affairs' responsibility or mandate to kind of address the larger question about how do Canadian people ensure that the sources of information that they receive come from bona fide sources and that the information that they receive are accurate.
OK, intéressante réponse.
Interesting answer. If it's not the role of Global Affairs Canada to ensure that a foreign power cannot intervene in internal Canada affairs and take part in disinformation, who should be in charge of dealing with this in the Canadian nation?
Mr. Chair, I think there are a number of agencies of the Government of Canada who are charged with ensuring national security. I would turn to them first in terms of their mandate in order to mitigate foreign interference or the proliferation of disinformation from international channels onto Canadian soil.
Mr. Bergeron, I'm sorry, you are out of time, sir. We'll have to go then to Ms. Blaney for 6 minutes or less.
Well, thank you, Chair, and I appreciate you getting my name correct that time. I want to thank all of you for being here today, and I appreciate your time and your testimony. We know that Canada pursues unofficial engagement with Taiwan in accordance to its One China policy, as you spoke of earlier. Are there any discussions at Global Affairs or in the government that you are aware of that would review or amend the One China policy?
Thank you for the question. I think our Indo-Pacific strategy that was released on Sunday by the Government of Canada makes it quite clear where we stand vis-a-vis Taiwan, and our reiteration that we will remain consistent with our One China policy. That being said, there is, in our view, lots of room for interpretation of engagement with Taiwan in Canada's national interests and values. And I believe that the Indo-Pacific strategy does cover, in terms of engagement with Taiwan, consistent with our One China policy, a number of areas beyond trade, such as technology, health, democratic governance, and countering disinformation, as just a few things that we can do within the rubric of that One China policy.
So it's interesting, you talked about some of the ways that we can expand as Canada, deepening the engagement with Taiwan and the actors in Taiwanese society. So you mentioned a few of those, but I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how do you think Canada can deepen its economic ties with Taiwan?
Mr. Chair, I think that the Government of Canada has already announced a means to expand its economic relationship with Taiwan through the launch of the exploratory discussions on a foreign investment protection arrangement. And as I indicated previously, the Government of Canada is on a pathway soon in order to communicate the results of that exploratory process that is now concluded. That foreign investment protection arrangement, if proceeded upon, will in fact buttress what is already a robust trading relationship between Taiwan and Canada, as just one example of what we can do. The other example is the result of the Canada-Taiwan economic bilateral consultations, which I had the privilege to chair on behalf of Canada with Taiwan, whereby one positive outcome that was agreed to was the production of a supply chain resiliency MOU in a number of sectors, and that would provide comfort to a number of sectors of our economies in terms of working more closely together.
Thank you for that. So I'm curious if you could speak a little bit about the implications of Russia's invasion on Ukraine and what that means for Taiwan.
Mr. Chair, I'm going to ask my colleague Weldon Epp to respond to that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think it's an excellent question, and I would say that it has been the subject of much analysis and much discussion. Obviously, and I know the member is well aware, the situations are quite unique and quite different in many ways. But what's been fascinating is to see how all parties involved in tensions across the strait have been taking on board lessons learned. And so we're well aware that the Taiwanese authorities are reviewing and revisiting some of their own assumptions, planning and operating assumptions around self-defense. And we'll see some of that play out over the coming years. I think we're also quite concerned with any lessons that the PRC might inadvertently take away with respect to Western resolve to, as the minister said recently, oppose any unilateral change to the status quo across the Taiwan Strait. So I think the kind of economic sanctions and quick consolidated pushback against Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been interesting. But the Chinese have always taken a very long view of Taiwan, and their approach is not it's not contingent on any particular timelines. And I suspect they'll also be taking away lessons from what's happened in Ukraine, and we may see some of that coming out of the Party Congress with respect to decisions around their own supply chain security domestically and capacity to withstand those kind of counteractions and responses. So although the situations are quite different, unfortunately there will be a lot of sort of revisiting of assumptions around Taiwan's security, and it makes it all the more concerning for Canada because that brings into play the risk of miscalculations or misunderstandings. One of the primary concerns being the kind of exercises that we saw the PLA undertake in August.
Thank you. I only have a few seconds left, so I'm going to let them go so that I can ask another questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Blaney. Appreciate that. We'll now go to Ms. Stancho for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being with us today. Appreciate it very much. The last time you were here, there was a story breaking about those alleged 3 Chinese-run police stations operating illegally in Canada. I'm wondering if you've had an official dialogue or bilateral meeting with the ambassador to express Canada's outrage of these allegations.
So, Mr. Chair, the short answer is yes. We've had several engagements. We've called the ambassador in on multiple occasions, and we have conveyed our deep concern. The government of Canada has formally insisted that the Chinese government take account for, including the ambassador and his embassy, for any activities within Canada that fall outside of the Vienna Conventions, and account for those, ensure that they cease and desist, And we continue to hold open the possibility of following up on those meetings with further decisions for how we take that forward, depending on how they respond.
Thank you very much for that response. Have you reviewed the credentials or the of the diplomats from China, if they've had any involvement with these alleged police stations in Canada?
So, Mr. Chair, that's an excellent question. I would say that we are not at liberty in an open context to discuss, our ability to work with partners from across town to acquire that kind of knowledge.
Okay, thank you very much. Switching to another topic, the Indo-Pacific strategy, I was hoping you can shed some light on. I was hoping to see Canada position itself a bit more towards the AUKUS agreement or the quadrilateral security dialogue. Those weren't mentioned in the strategy. Are we not striving to join those? Is that not to me, it just seems that it's not a priority. Perhaps you can explain why that is and if that is detrimental at all. It seems like it would fit very well based on the language used and the partners that we're looking to partner with to share intelligence and the like. So if you could just comment, that'd be appreciated.
Thank you very much for the question. I think it's one that others have asked as well, so it's a very good one. I think Canada, looks at plurilateral groupings regardless of what the objective is, based on whether there's obviously a Canadian interest to do so. I think when we look at AUKUS, I think the Prime Minister was clear that it's an arrangement in order to acquire nuclear submarines, and to my knowledge, the National Defence is not necessarily advocating the acquisition of that. There is, within the purposes of the conference of that agreement, to our understanding, working groups on other aspects such as emerging and critical technologies. That is of interest. And we have informed Australia of our interest for certain aspects of the working groups under that agreement. And Australia has been favorable to that.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, my next question is on critical technologies, jumping around a little bit. Taiwan, microchip semiconductors, there's been a lot of discussion that if China takes over Taiwan, so to speak, that they would be, in essence, in full control of the largest producer of semiconductors, microchips in the world, and that we would be, us along with most other countries in the world, be very vulnerable. Has Canada had any discussions with our allies to make us less reliant on Taiwan for this? Is this on the radar? I did not read every word in the Indo-Pacific strategy yet, but I did not notice that was a priority or a concern. So I'm wondering if it is a concern and what we're doing about it.
Mr. Chair, I'm going to ask my colleague Weldon to respond to that.
Well, Mr. Chair, a couple of things in response to that. I mean, first of all, just to respond to the premise of the question, which is a really important one, and some members may have noted a very recent but excellent report by the Rhodium Group, which is based on economic modeling costing the impact to the global economy, mainly because of supply chain for chips, of just an economic blockade. So if you imagine China doing what it did as an exercise in August, but using that to enforce an economic blockade, that alone would have, they estimate, something like a first-order impact of $2.5 trillion on the global economy. And there's two reasons that's really important. It gets to the question, Mr. Chair, that was asked, which is, how do we work with partners to ensure that disruption to an essential part of everything we do in our whole economy is something we don't wait to plan for the day after there's an embargo, et cetera. So there are very active discussions. I think what's also important about the Rhodium Group study is to say that this should be a concern not just for China itself. Its own economy would be impacted by disruption to supply chains in the chip sector, but to Canada as well, but as well as to China's most immediate neighbors. So the line or the premise from the Chinese government that what happens across the Taiwan Strait is an internal affair, with respect, even the kind of exercise they undertook in August would have an immediate global economic impact. I think the premise of a scenario where China would take over Taiwan and then be able to control that supply is very hypothetical, and there's lots of variables there. And I think that's why organizations like the Rhodium Group have sort of responded to your question, but just by isolating even a more limited impact. And it would make the economic impact of Ukraine look small in comparison.
Thank you very much, Ms. Dancho. We'll now go to Mr. Dubourg, who's going to split time with Ms. Yip. Mr. Dubourg?
Yes. Thank you, Chair. Exactly, I'm going to share my time with Mrs. Yip. Tout d'abord, je voudrais saluer les...
First of all, I'd like to say welcome to the witnesses this evening and thank you for your attendance. I do have a question I'd like to ask. First of all, I would like to say that I salute the Indo-Pacific strategy. But in the current geopolitical context, a witness told us, and I'll read what he said with an approximate translation, Peking seems to be increasingly aware of the fact that Taiwan is not going to fall into its hands peacefully, and that some form of confrontation with the U.S. and its allies is inevitable. In that context, when we launched that strategy, could you tell us how Canada should prepare itself for a potential risk, and what impact could this have on this Indo-Pacific strategy, please?
Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to take that question. And I think the member's right in citing the fact that analysts and governments around the world look at the situation across the Taiwan Strait and recognize a basic obvious fact that I think we very much are taking to heart in our own policy planning. And that is that a situation that for decades had a relatively stable external environment. There were ups and downs and tensions, but basically the premise was quite stable. That's changing. It's dynamic, and there is a lot of concern. After that, things get more muddy, of course, because we're talking about the future. And so, of course, there is concern that the Chinese leadership has put a bit of a clock on the situation in Taiwan. And some analysts focus very much on a time frame. And I guess a couple of points that I would want to make is, one, that I think that it's hasty for us to assume that an invasion of Taiwan is inevitable. We all know that the official policy of the Communist Party and all of their planning is to reunify Taiwan, but their preference obviously would be to take any action that could do so short of a kinetic activity or warfare, not least for the impact that warfare would have on their own economy and their own people. So there is no inevitable invasion, but there is now growing tension. And so I think that, to your second part of your question, is where, Mr. Chair, is where Canada is very actively working with like-minded to understand how do we respond effectively to a dynamic situation, but with a common goal. And the common goal, again, as the minister has made very clear in her public statements, and we have diplomatically, and the minister has also to her ministerial counterpart, Minister Wang Yi, Canada is in very good company in opposing any action that would unilaterally destabilize the Taiwan Strait, the situation across the strait. But that can't happen in isolation. We can't have impact on that on our own. And that's why there are very, ongoing discussions. And that's why I think you see the G7 in the last few months has increasingly spoken up to, with a shared voice, make those same points. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mrs. Yip, it's your turn.
Thank you. In reaction to Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan this past August, the PRC imposed target sanctions banning the imports of fruits and seafood from Taiwan. And I can recall in previous years that there have been other fruit sanctions, like with pineapples, causing much lost trade financially and food wastage in Taiwan. Is this an ongoing issue with China, and how does Taiwan deal with these trade fluctuations?
Chair, what China did in response to Taiwan is yet another example of economic coercion that Canada has felt, and a long history of coercion against other countries to advance political objectives. Norway, Lithuania, Australia, South Korea, just to name a few. It is hard for exporters to have a reliance that is somehow dominant in their revenue stream with one buyer, as it is for many, as a previous member had indicated with regards to fisheries, and then suddenly find, after so many years of predictability, that it's suddenly interrupted. It causes tremendous hardship, and there are two challenges. One is, how do you keep your current operations going? And then where do you find the funds in order to try to seek out new markets? It is that very unpredictability that is the heart of one of the strategic objectives in the strategy in order to encourage Canadian businesses to diversify. And the Government of Canada is trying to set that table within our markets to do so.
Thank you, Ms. Yip. Appreciate your question. It's time now to go to Mr. Bergeron for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Si vous me le permettez.
Thank you, Chair. Gentlemen, if I may, I would like to come back to the line of questioning that I had begun previously. Based on the conversations which you held with your Taiwanese counterparts, I have two questions. First, do you feel that the Taiwanese are open to sharing with us their experience? And second question, have you been in touch with the relative Canadian agencies for this type of issue when you came back?
Je pense, Monsieur.
Chair, I believe that the question is very relevant.
The One China policy provides significant opportunity to engage with Taiwan, where, as I said previously, is within the Canadian national interest. You have recognized in the question that there is an expertise that they have that's in our interest to learn from, and conversations have been initiated in order for that very same reason, both in terms of how they address countering disinformation, and I cited how they're doing so in terms of speed and responsiveness. And also, perhaps they are, the best party globally in terms of understanding China and China's behaviors. And so it is incumbent upon us, in order to engage, to work with them to best understand and therefore incorporate what are practices that would work in our system.
Alors, je vous repose la question, à moins que j'ai mal saisi.
So let me repeat the question, unless I misunderstood. Do you feel that there's an openness among the Taiwanese to share with us the fruit of their experience? And have you communicated this with the relevant agencies when you came back to Canada?
The answer would be yes to both of those questions.
Merci beaucoup. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Go to Ms. Blaney for 2.5 minutes or less.
Well, thank you, Chair. I know that the Indo-Pacific strategy outlines 5 pillars or objectives. Can you please expand on what promoting peace, resilience, and security looks like in Taiwan? And furthermore, what role, if any at all, should NATO have in preventing tensions between great powers from escalating into armed conflict in the Indo-Pacific?
Mr. Chair, in terms of the questions posed, I think the Indo-Pacific strategy is clear that what Canada aspires is the status quo in terms of regional peace and stability in the region, and therefore we will engage together with other like-minded in terms of opposing any unilateral actions that will threaten the status quo. And as part of that effort, Canada has invested in a number of initiatives in order to help contribute to the status quo and the regional peace and security in that area. And that is a multi-initiative contribution, including an enhanced naval presence, a cybersecurity initiative, as just citing two elements under that strategic objective of promoting peace and resilience and security. In terms of the second question on NATO, I think we need to be mindful that NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And therefore, we need to be mindful of what Asian countries would like in terms of how do they organize, discuss, and reach out to non-Asian countries in terms of their desires to have them engage in order to be helpful to that regard. And that's why participation in forums such as the ASEAN Post-Ministerial Conference and the ASEAN Regional Forum are very important so that we can understand what is it that they need in terms of supports in order to deal with their objective and our objective, which is regional peace.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, we did get started a little late on this panel, but we also have, of course, a changeover to make to the next panel. So actually, what I'm going to propose is 2.5 minutes for each. So we'll start with Mr. Chong for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a very quick question. Ministers Freeland and Champagne have talked recently about reducing trade with the People's Republic of China and other authoritarian countries. Minister Freeland was in Washington on October 11th at Brookings talking about friendshoring. Minister Champagne was in Washington on October 21st talking about decoupling. How does reducing trade, reducing commercial relations, in other words, friendshoring or decoupling, how is that consistent with the Indo-Pacific strategy, which says that Canada will continue to protect Canadian market access in China? That's my question.
Thank you very much for the question. Minister Ng has been clear that we will continue to trade with China. And Minister Joly has also been very clear that Canadian businesses should engage in trade with China, but take a wide eyes open approach. What the Government of Canada is trying to do to be helpful to Canadian business is to ensure that Canadian business revenue is not dominated by a revenue flow that comes from an autocratic states, whereby we have seen sudden cutoffs in terms of unpredictability. And therefore, we're trying to facilitate that diversification through various free trade agreements and other mechanisms in order to encourage Canadian business to reduce their dependencies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chong. We'll go to Mr. Oliphant and Mr. Bergeron, and then Ms. Blaney for 2.5 minutes each. There we go.
Just want to know whether you have any comment on the recent resignation of the president as the chair of the party, where she has occupied that position of chair of the party a number of times, but resigned because of losses in local elections, is what I read in the newspaper. And what those losses for her party in the local elections mean with respect to the relationship between Taiwan and the People's Republic of China, because that had been an election issue apparently in the local elections, causing her then to have losses and then moving. Just wondering, is there a shift in the attitude in Taiwan people, or were those local elections about something else? Elections sometimes are about not what we think they're about.
I'll take if I may, Ms. Chair, I'll take a respond initially, and then I'll also encourage my colleague Weldon up to respond as well. I think what you have seen with the step down is really a strong signal of democracy and a tone of leadership, whereby a party leader has not seen a party do well in elections and take accountability. And that is something that I think all democracies should take note of and take pride in going forward. I think that it was a local election. It wasn't a national election. And I think that voters in a local environment are looking for different things at the local level than the national one. Weldon?
I think, Mr. Chair, that largely covers it. And the short answer to the member's question is I don't think any credible evidence that the results of the local elections suggest a shift in fundamental attitudes of the Taiwanese people towards their own future and the posture of the PRC. One of the wonderful things about elections in Taiwan is that often, even at the national level, a lot of people aren't voting because of the topics that we pay attention to, like cross-strait tensions, and the friends that we have in Taiwan are often focused on, local issues like environmental, et cetera. So I think while one of the parties tried to make it about that and campaigned on that, I think the result of that was quite resounding, and I think that's one of the reasons why the result that you referred to, stepping down as party leader, was the step taken. Thanks.
Mr. Oliphant, Mr. Bergeron for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. The new Indo-Pacific strategy said that Canada would work with partners to strengthen and extend Trans-Pacific Partnership and to ensure that any form of expansion in this partnership would be based on high standards, and that Canada would strengthen its ties and its commercial ties with Taiwan. Given the circumstances, are we to understand that Canada is going to plead in Taiwan's favor to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership?
Mr. Chair, I think the focus by CPTP members, including Canada, is to ensure that the first accession member into CPTPP, which is the UK, meets the high bar that's embedded in the agreement through the results of the negotiations. It's clear that there is still work to be done in that regard with the UK before there is a satisfactory conclusion. The CPP members are very mindful of the fact that the first member post the agreement in terms of accession is a presidential one. Because it sets the bar for all the others who aspire to want to join, and that includes Taiwan. So what the CPT members are saying is we really got to get the UK one right first, and that's what the focus is on now. And so there is no real conversation at this juncture with regards to others that have expressed interest related to entry.
Do you believe that the fact that the People's Republic of China has also demonstrated its interest is going to make some members be more hesitant in considering Taiwan's candidacy, even if several believe that Taiwan is already meeting several of the criteria for admission into the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is not the case with the People's Republic of China?
I think CPTPP economies are very mindful of the interest of China and Taiwan in there. And I think they're also mindful of Taiwan's ability in terms of meeting the high standards. And I think that there may be some questions with regards to China's ability to do so. But China also brings significant market access and elements there. But quite frankly, the focus is really not on those parties. The focus is really on the UK and getting the UK negotiations right.
Thank you, Mr. Bergeron. Appreciate that. Ms. Blaney for the final 2.5 minutes.
Well, Chair, I only have one question, so we'll see how long it takes. We know that Taiwan is a champion of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I'm just wondering if you can share with us in what ways Canada can learn from Taiwan and collaborate moving forward to ensure that Canada delivers on its development commitments.
Sure. Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I think there are a number of areas in which we encourage growing collaboration between not only relevant government agencies that are responsible for different aspects of UN development goals, but also civil society. And so I think those would include deep collaboration that already we've seen for decades between Canadian and Taiwanese Indigenous communities, so meeting both developmental and cultural preservation heritage objectives of Indigenous communities. We've seen this with respect to learning from the Taiwanese, how they manage health outcomes. It's a very different environment than Canada, but it's an environment in which they have adopted in the past much of the Canadian approach to public health system, public health insurance, but with local characteristics. So when things like SARS or the pandemic we're currently experiencing have broken out, we've taken advantage of that opportunity to look at not only how is Taiwan managing those health outcomes, but are there lessons learned there for the work that we do as a member of UN agencies across, the commitments of the UN to global outcomes, health outcomes or development outcomes. I would say just beyond that, Taiwan offers a very interesting governance story, a positive story, and that gets at the capacity to move from being one of the poorest countries in Asia only 100 years ago, or one of the poorest jurisdictions, to being an economy today that is dynamic, has a high GDP per capita, but is also very inclusive in terms of participation by women, participation by other minority groups. And so there are a lot of lessons there. And Canada has worked with other partners and Taiwan through something called the GCTN, Global Initiatives sort of platform that is, although outside the UN system and outside international organizations, a platform the Taiwanese government has put in play to offer its best practices. So we've now sponsored 2 of those events, and we look forward to working with Taiwan, Japan, the US, and others to kind of bring to the fore Taiwan's unique experiences, even though it's not able to sit at UN organizations and do so formally itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that brings to a close our first panel this evening. I'd like to thank our 3 guests for appearing this evening. And thank you for your input.
We will now... order?
Yes, sir.
I just want to ensure that the testimony in this panel is not too late to be included in the report. That is, we started doing drafting instructions for last week, and I'm hoping it's still open, mainly on the clarification between the One China principle and the One China policy, which I think was the first time we've had that really clearly sort of stated for our committee. So if that is okay.
Yes, the analysts are nodding. And as we mentioned off the top, we can use the material that we've heard in our first panel on both the Taiwan study and the trade study that we're starting now. We'll pause for a moment then to set up our second panel. Witnesses, where are the party whips when I need them? All right, let us begin. I'd like to welcome our witnesses for the second hour. As individuals, Dr. Geneviève Dufour, Professor of International Law at the Université de Sherbrooke. Dr. Laura Murphy, Professor, Human Rights and Contemporary Slavery, Sheffield Hallam University, where it is 1:30 in the morning. And from the Uyghur Rights Advocacy Project, Mehmet Tohi, the Executive Director, and K.M. Mazimov, Project Manager. Each of you, or at least group, will have 5 minutes to make an opening statement, and we will start with Dr. Dufour for 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to appear. I am a professor of international law, and my research focus is on the relationship between international trade law, human rights, and environmental law. So Canada's relations with China fall within my area of expertise to the extent that products imported from China are often suspected of having been produced in conditions which do not meet our standards for human rights and environmental protection. With some exceptions, Canadian industry very often import input from China, and our retail shops sell products from China. In addition, Canada signed a bilateral investment treaty with China to encourage Chinese companies to come to Canada. Our investment funds and pension plans invest in these Canadian companies which import Chinese products and in these Chinese companies which have established themselves in Canada. These plans and funds, even though often managed by people who are of goodwill, wish to invest in companies focusing on sustainability, social responsibility, but don't have the means to ensure that this is in fact the case. Some countries have found a solution for this problem. They've adopted legislation imposing a duty of vigilance upon the businesses that are on their territories. This has been the case in France since 2017. In Germany, it will be as of this coming January the 1st, and likely Mexico because it is currently in the process of adopting very ambitious legislation. Under these laws respecting the duty of vigilance, these countries require that their businesses train their employees on human rights and environmental protection, that they encourage them to identify risks of non-compliance in the supply chain, and they oblige them to take the necessary steps to avoid or stop any violations. If not, there are sanctions or other consequences, such as being prohibited from bidding on tender calls for a period of time. Countries which pass this kind of legislation also provide for recourse to domestic courts so that victims, who are often foreign victims of violations, can be compensated. And finally, the duty of vigilance implies an accountability exercise for companies. Ideally, this is a public exercise. So each year, businesses must produce data, demonstrate that they have taken steps to avoid dealing with non-compliant suppliers, and they must indicate where their products and inputs come from. To date, Canada imposes no such duty of vigilance on its businesses. As a result, Canadian business has no obligation to determine whether the products that they are importing, whether they're using as inputs or that they are marketing, have been manufactured respecting human rights and environmental protection standards. Some companies self-impose vigilance, but they set the conditions for this vigilance, and several companies do not do this. And there is no registry, so that an investment fund or a pension plan cannot know today what the true level of respect for human rights or environmental standards is of a company throughout its supply chain. And as we know, a lot of our supplies come from China. Last week, over 100 academics signed a letter to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and I'm one of these signatories. We asked him to impose on Canadian business a due diligence requirement for human rights and environmental standards. As we mentioned in our letter, for over 20 years, the Canadian government was content to simply state that it expected Canadian business to respect human rights. But that strategy does not work. Canada should adopt this type of legislation if it wants to be a leader in respect for human rights and environmental protection, and if it wants to comply with its international obligations, and if it wants to achieve its sustainable development goals. It also should do this to ensure that products coming into its territory were not manufactured in conditions which violate human rights and environmental laws, and to ensure that we do not invest in companies that are guilty of such violations. Without a vigilance legislation, our businesses and our importers have no obligation to check that what they import is all right and to be accountable. Our investors, our endowment funds, and our pension plans can therefore not make the necessary choices. So if Canada truly wants to care about where goods investment come from and to be sure that they're sustainable, there is no good reason to not do as has been done in France, Norway, the Netherlands, and Germany, all of whom have adopted modern and progressive legislation. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Dufour. Now we'll go to Dr. Murphy for 5 minutes or less.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me to speak before this committee today and for the opportunity to present alongside these esteemed colleagues, including members of the affected Uyghur community. It is now widely known that the People's Republic of China is conducting a program of repression in the Uyghur region unlike anything we have ever seen in our lifetimes. The PRC's deliberate, iron-fisted governance strategy in the region operates through at least 3 intersecting mechanisms of control: internment, surveillance, and forced labor. Together, these 3 mechanisms are tools designed to suppress not only dissent, but also culture, religion, and population demographics of the Uyghur people. They function to control everyday behaviors and seek even to control the very thoughts of Uyghurs and other minoritized peoples. Internment and surveillance serve as a form of coercion that ensures that Uyghurs become docile and compliant workforce in factories across the region and indeed across China. Sheffield Hallam's research that I'm the lead author on has been presented in 6 in-depth studies that have found that companies are complicit in the PRC's system of repression in that they participate in the recruitment, forced migration, indoctrination, confinement, surveillance, and disciplining of Uyghur people, both inside and outside of the factories and farms the companies operate. They are an integral and active and even enthusiastic part of the ongoing genocide in the Uyghur region. Recent research we conducted to identify whether companies known to be complicit in this system were being listed by index funds found that the MSCI, one of the leading index funds in the world, an index that is used as a benchmark for most others, includes at least 13 companies that have been identified in credible media and other research reports as being involved in the internment, surveillance, and forced labor in the Uyghur region. Some of these companies have even been sanctioned by the US government, and still they remain on these lists that determine much about where our retirement and investment dollars go. One of those companies, China Railway Group, for instance, is on several MSCI indexes and is the literal architect of the Tumshuk prison in the Uyghur region, a place that was transformed from an ordinary prison into a de facto internment camp where people are detained for simply practicing their religion without due process or a fair trial. ZTE, a partially state-owned telecom company, is also on the MSCI indexes. It has advertised that its products are used, quote, to monitor the political opposition, activists, and journalists of China. Hoshine Silicon Company, a privately owned but heavily state-subsidized company that makes products for the solar and automotive industries, among others, has been involved in the transfers of hundreds of Uyghur people against their wills to factories and mines deep in the desert of the Uyghur region, admittedly taking them away from their families and farms to be, quote, transformed into ideal worker citizens. These findings were the result of a simple review of index funds based on publicly available knowledge that has been widely exposed by the media. Actively invested funds also invest in stocks of a vast array of complicit companies, including the ones I just named. Asset managers would only need to do a simple internet search for some of these companies to know the extent of their participation in these rights violations. Many people have no idea that their pensions and investments are being used for the benefit of companies that profit from the oppression of the Uyghur people. Government should ensure that its citizens aren't unwittingly reaping the dividends of this human rights crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Murphy. Now we'll go to Mr. Toti. You will now have 5 minutes for your opening comments, sir.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, the members, for this opportunity. And first of all, I apologize. My voice is muffled. Yesterday, I shouted too much against Chinese embassy in University of Ottawa. I will be providing a testimony on Canadian investments in Uyghur genocide today from some university funds perspective. This is a reality across Canadian pension funds, university endowment funds, and other organized funds, and it must be stopped. There are enough reports that detail the complicity of Canadian federal pension funds as well as other provincial pension funds in the Uyghur genocide. These pension funds have directly or indirectly invested in companies that are tied up with the Uyghur genocide, Uyghur forced labor, construction of repressive infrastructure such as concentration camps, prisons, surveillance technology that are part of integrated joint operational platform that is used for immediate identification and the arrest of Uyghurs and others through ethno-religious profiling. Through investments in companies conducting surveillance of Uyghurs in diaspora, we are complicit in the transnational oppression of more than 2,000 Uyghur Canadians, our neighbors and friends. Earlier this year, in March, 2 young undergraduate students from McGill University uncovered 15 million of their school's 1.9 billion endowment fund was invested in Uyghur genocide through companies tied up Uyghur forced labor and surveillance. After we invested more time into finding matches from McGill's investment portfolio, we found the investments reached nearly $100 million. Some of the companies McGill invests in are directly linked to labor transfer program in the Uyghur region, including mining companies. Others are involved in surveillance technology like Alibaba, or a technology that controls smart prison used to detain Uyghurs like Tencent. Some are sanctioned by the United States. They are still on the sanction list. This is likely not an isolated event. We suspect that all or most Canadian universities' investments are similarly complicit in the Uyghur genocide, and we are collecting additional research to expand this. Meanwhile, students at McGill have mobilized and urging their school to divest from companies implicated in the Uyghur genocide and to change their investment portfolio to reflect their students' interest and commitments to protecting human rights. We must also protect our country's principles and obligations. The Canadian Parliament recognized the Uyghur genocide in February 2021. Widespread of Uyghur forced labor is undisputed. Since that time, Canada Pension Plan's investment in China have only grown. This paradox can be seen throughout our government. As we release business advisory on Canadian companies and table forced labor legislation that will at best prevent imported goods from Uyghur region, if it is even successful at that, we carry on making money off our covert business relationship with China and deepen our business ties, despite warnings and statements from senior government officials. Given the gravity and the scope of this issue, the ongoing Uyghur genocide and a lack of action from the government, forced labor and a lack of enforcement from CBSA, Chinese interference in Canada, and our public funds heavily investing in companies tied up to Uyghur genocide, we came to believe that strong legislative action is needed more than ever to reflect at least senior government officials' statement on this matter. It must be a painful moral bankruptcy for each and every one of us sitting here to receive a pension at some point in our lives tainted by the genocide we condemned once altogether unanimously. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Toti. We will now go to our first round of questioning, and we'll begin with Mr. Chong for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for appearing. You know, this is, I think, a very important issue. This Parliament has recognized that a genocide is taking place in Xinjiang against the Uyghur and other Turkic Muslim minorities in the region, some 12 million of whom are living in an open-air, 24-hour surveillance state, open-air prison, I would add. You know, the Government of Canada has had laws on the books now for 2 years that have banned the import of products produced using forced labor, something that was brought in by the government to bring our statutes into compliance with the United States, Mexico, Canada Free Trade Agreement. But despite that, products continue to flow in. But let's just set that aside right now and say that it seems incongruous that we would ban products produced by companies that are using forced labor, but still allow Canadian investors and pension funds, directly or indirectly, to invest in those very companies. And to me, that seems to be a bit of a loophole in current Canadian policy. So my first question is this. In the United States, they have listed firms that U.S. investment firms, pension funds, and others are banned from buying or selling equities in. Initially, there was a list of about 30 firms. It's, I think, been now expanded to about 60 firms, where American investors and pension funds are prohibited from buying or selling shares of these Chinese equities. And so my first question is, do you think that that is a model to be followed, that the Government of Canada would list equities of these firms in the People's Republic of China that are on the banned list, and that would be a way to affect a policy, or is there a better policy solution than that? So that's for all the witnesses.
Perhaps we can ask Dr. Murphy to respond if she has a response to this.
Sure. Thank you for that question. I'll start by saying that I think that the import ban is a critical tool that the Government of Canada already has to address forced labor in the Uyghur region, and it is not being enforced. And I think you're right that this is a real problem. What's happening in Canada now is that Canada and the EU and the UK have become dumping grounds for forced labor made goods made in the Uyghur region, because the US is sending those products back away from their borders. And you know, Canada is the closest place those products can go. So I think it's critical that import ban be enforced. But I think having an entities list of companies that are known to be engaged in forced labor or internment or surveillance, this kind of surveillance state, would be a useful tool. I think that probably Dr. Dufour can talk more about the legislative aspects of it, but I think that we need to be able to say that there are some companies that are simply beyond the pale and that are integrally involved in these programs, and that they individually cannot be invested in.
Well, two of them that come to mind, if Mr. Chair, if I might interrupt, is Hikvision or Hikvision and Huawei, both of which have been listed by the U.S. Through executive order by the U.S. government. But I'm interested to hear from the other witnesses on what is the best way to prevent investments in firms that are complicit with a genocide or complicit with using forced labor.
Yes, Dr. Dufour, I believe Dr. Murphy handed it off to you, so perhaps you can respond. Hello, Dr. Dufour, can you hear us? Oh, looks like we may have... There we go.
Oui, je vous entends très bien.
Yes, I can hear you. I thought that this question depended on Ms. Murphy's response.
Maybe Mr. Todi, Mr. Chair, would have an answer on this, on what the best way to prevent investments in firms complicit with a genocide or complicit in the use of forced labor.
And as Professor Laura Murphy said, and we are not acting. And the government is not imposing the existing law, and the CBSA did not seize so far a single shipment entering Canada made by the use of Uyghur forced labor. And just we are strengthening the Chinese regime by directly investing our public funds into the Chinese companies that tied up with the genocide and the forced labor. At the same time, we are allowing those companies to raise funds from stock markets. And also, we are purchasing those products in Canadian market as well. So we are fully supporting the Chinese ongoing policy by using slave labor to produce products, at the same time committing genocide. And every dollar we send to China, it does not strengthen the people. It strengthens the Chinese Communist Party and the Xi Jinping. And now we are using we are seeing that Chinese government is using all sorts of the violence against the peaceful protesters. That strength comes from our invested dollars. So we have to use a legislative approach, or we have to just simply copy what the U.S. did.
Thank you, Mr. Toti, and thank you, Mr. Chong. For the benefit of the rest of the people asking questions, it would be useful if you direct your question to the individual who you wish to hear from. We'll now go to Mr. Oliphant for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to thank all the witnesses. I'm probably going to focus a little bit on Professor Murphy and Dufour because I'm trying to sort out in my head a spectrum of activity. First of all, I don't think there's going to be any disagreement around this table that we have a problem in our world with the integrity of supply chain, the contribution of commerce and trade to internment, forced labor, surveillance of Uyghur, as well as other people. So what I'm trying to understand is the best approach then out of that. And there's a spectrum from disclosure, and I did a bill on that in 2009 on pension fund disclosure, through to due diligence, through to the French model of the duty of vigilance. And I'm trying to kind of understand that because even though you mentioned the Netherlands and another country, I believe France is the only country that actually has instituted that concept of duty of vigilance. And I've also read reports that it may not be effective. So just perhaps the two of you could comment on that range of options we could recommend and the effectiveness of each one and the practicality of enforcement of each one of those options. Thank you. Professor Murphy first, perhaps Professor Dufour after that.
Thank you for that. I keep deferring to Professor Dufour because her point was about the duty of vigilance. So I'll leave that piece to her. But I'll say that that there has to be layered approaches to this. I think you're right that there is a spectrum, of course, but there are also sort of multiple different angles at which you can address this. So on the one hand, you might directly, as we were talking about, have a ban on particular companies, investments on those particular companies. But there also must be mandatory human rights due diligence for all companies operating in Canada to investigate their supply chain, to know it all the way down to its raw materials. At this time, that is not mandatory. That is a voluntary protocol that a company can choose to do. And the vast majority of companies do not choose to do it. In fact, they intentionally don't want to know what's happening at the roots, at the most upstream parts of their supply chains, because we know that that's where the most abuse and exploitation happens. And so I think that we need a full mandatory human rights due diligence policy that includes transparency, traceability, accountability for companies that do not do this. This is another problem with a lot of international anti-slavery or forced labor laws, is that there's no accountability. If a company does not do what they're supposed to do, there's no enforcement and there's no penalty for doing it. Those penalties also need to be sufficient to deter companies from just ignoring the law and paying the fine as a cost of business. I think those pieces are the critical ones, but I'll leave it to Professor Dufour to talk more about the duty of diligence law internationally, which I don't know as much about.
Merci.
Thank you. You're right. Until recently, France was the model for vigilance legislation. And France was the first to adopt a duty of vigilance to apply to all sectors, and companies of a certain size who had cross-border activities. But since then, other countries have passed vigilance legislation. Norway is one of them. The Netherlands as well. And starting on January the 1st, in a month, in other words, Germany will have a law on vigilance, which I consider to be the most progressive in this area. The law will apply to a considerable number of firms and deals with several human rights, all of fundamental labor laws. But in addition, there are other human rights. There's a decent wage component. There is an environmental standard component. There's also recourse to security officers with excessive use in business and industry. So they've adopted a rather wide net to ensure good working conditions for employees. Several environmental standards are referred to, corruption, etc. It's a very interesting piece of legislation because business is going to truly have a broad duty of diligence. And when they do not respect the law, their directors can be penalized. All of the employees who are aware will be punished. Companies will be.
Does the French law and perhaps Norwegian or another Dutch law apply equally and the same to investors, such as institutional investors or investment bodies, as it does to people that are making things and selling things, companies that are engaged? There's a different approach to, I think, that, but I thought the French law only applied to actual enterprises with 5,000 employees in France or 10,000 employees worldwide, which is different than an investment fund.
A very brief answer, please, Dr. Dufour. Thank you.
Je crois que la loi allemande.
I believe the German legislation goes much farther. And in terms of businesses, it's first going to apply to large businesses, but eventually it will apply to almost all business. There's a schedule.
Very much, Mr. Bergeron, for 6 minutes or less.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to our witnesses. Thank you for your comments, which enrich our examination of this issue. Professor Dufour, I listen to you speak, and I get the impression that Canada is light years away from the best practices in the world. As you know, there's Bill S-211, which is at its final stages before being adopted. We had our clause-by-clause review of the legislation in the Foreign Affairs Committee yesterday. And in the public hearing, several witnesses told us that this bill doesn't go far enough, that all it does is compel companies to be accountable about practices which could involve forced labor, but nothing more. So if you pass this, the international experience shows us that generally people feel good because they say, we passed this law and we won't go any further. What do you think of that?
Je remercie pour votre question.
Thank you for your question. I think that California did this in 2010 and now it's 2022, or it's soon 2023. So you're right, we are behind. Of course, in the early 2010s, it was an innovative thing to be doing, to say, finally, we're going to be able to compel companies to do their share to respect the environment and to respect human rights. Especially, it was the idea was the beginning of the idea was only being applied to forced labor or in certain industries, mining in some countries. There was a U.S. law regarding activities in the Congo. But we realized that those laws are not effective, either because they're only applying to a certain industry or to only one problem, for example, forced labor. But we need companies to do their work globally. And they're the ones who are the best place to ensure that there is a better respect of human rights and environmental protection standards. The companies are doing the buying. They're doing the importing. They're doing the marketing. So those companies must do their part. So you're right. We are light years away from what should be done today. And that's why we say that this bill, S211, is not ambitious enough. It has no teeth. It's got no teeth. I agree with you. This being said, in the light of what we're hearing today, and of what some witnesses have told us recently, I think I'm thinking about Sheffield Hallam and Hong Kong Watch, who published a report saying that some investment funds, more specifically pension funds, government pension funds, are investing in the People's Republic of China, and they contribute to forced labor, and they contribute to working conditions which are absolutely terrible. And then we realize it's not just business that's to blame, potentially, for this contribution. Its contribution to forced labor, to the Uyghur genocide, that even public funds can be pension plans, can be blamed. So I'd like to turn to our Uyghur friends. Not only are these pension plans and investment funds contributing to genocide and to forced labor, but from the point of view of Quebec and Canadian investors, perhaps there's a major danger there. There's a delayed reaction here. There are Scandinavian pension funds who were invested in Ukraine, and then after the sanctions were applied by Western countries, Russia froze all of those investments. And so their taxpayers were subjected to all these losses. Is there not a risk that if there were to be an invasion of Taiwan, that China would do the same? And investors, Canadian and Quebec investors, would lose their assets?
For that question, it is excellent and eye-opening questions, and I hope Canada Pension Plan and the other provincial pension plan, including Quebec Pension Plan, will listen this question. And yes, you're absolutely right. And Quebec Pension Plan has an investment around $2 billion to $3 billion in Chinese companies associated with either the genocide directly or forced labor. And there are a list of companies the Quebec Pension Plan invested, and we know which company they invested, and we know what those companies are doing. They're exactly the same. The McGill University invested nearly $100 million, and we identified nearly the 7 companies directly associated with Uyghur genocide. Some companies helped to build surveillance technology for Chinese government, and some companies are part of the integral joint operational platform. And some companies are part of the birth prevention, the measures that Chinese government implemented on Uyghurs. And for that reason, it is alarming. And we met with the Canada Pension Plan Board, and they're basically defending their position that we did not invest on China or a country, rather rather we invest in companies. The problem is those companies under the direct control of Chinese Communist Party. They are receptive for every demand of Chinese government. For that reason, there is no any difference. And so we sent the letters to the pension boards, including provincial and federal pension boards. They are not receptive. They are not responsive. And there is a strong need for the Parliament of Canada to do something to address this issue. Otherwise, if there is any madness, and we can expect, I can simply expect that to happen, if any madness happen from the Xi Jinping, just press the button to invade Taiwan, and all investments will be wiped out. We are talking about
Mr. Todi, I'm
nearly
sorry,
$100 billion.
I have to interrupt you, sir. Mr. Bergeron's time has come and gone, and then some. So now it is time to welcome Mr. Bullrich to our committee this evening. Sir, you have 6 minutes or less.
Merci, merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm very happy to be with you today. I think this is an extremely important topic which really merits our attention, so thanks to the witnesses for being here to enlighten us. I'd like to go back to Bill S-211. Yes, there are criticisms that it doesn't go far enough on forced labor. And we're behind. Canada is behind. We agree. But is there no merit to the fact that the bill will oblige will force some transparency and some disclosure? Ms. Dufour and Ms. Murphy, if you could answer. Yes, of course. You can't be against virtue. This bill is a first step, but as we've said, we are so far behind, and we don't know why. How can we justify the fact that we didn't come up with a much more ambitious piece of legislation that's broader, that would have enabled us to be in the avant-garde? We say that Canada is a progressive country that can meet its sustainable development goals and that cares about environmental protection. Well, then why not? This is not the only area in which we lag behind. But when you try and look at the tools that countries are giving themselves abroad to be able to move forward with human rights, for example, responsible acquisitions, we don't know why in government procurement. Thank you. Ms. Murphy, do you have any comments?
I think that what we found with a lot of legislation around the world that requires companies to report on their actions in regard to forced labor and or other human rights violations is that these reporting mechanisms do not do enough to impel action. And that's where we really need to be focusing our efforts. And so I think that asking companies to tell us about what they're doing without saying, we will act on what you've done, that, without having an enforcement mechanism, does not go far enough. It just doesn't.
Yep. Merci beaucoup, Mme Murphy.
Thank you very much, Ms. Murphy. Professor Dufour, I don't want to put words into your mouth, but when it comes to Canada's lagging behind in human rights respect abroad, 75% of mining companies in the world are registered in Canada. Perhaps there's some connection, some cause and effect relationship here. Maybe you could examine it from that point of view. Now, you referred to the German legislation, which is perhaps the most progressive in the area. You began to talk about its provisions, which seem to me very interesting from several points of view. Human rights, labor rights, environmental protection. I'd like to hear more from you and perhaps other witnesses as well. How can we as a federal government gain inspiration from that German legislation to improve our practices? Thank you. You're right. We have a tremendous number of mining industries, but if there's one thing that we were able to do in Canada is that we set up the Ombudsperson's office so that there can be complaints regarding mining and other areas such as textiles. So we did open the door, and we would want to have finding organizations that are more respectful of these laws than in other countries. Now, how can we gain inspiration from the German law? Well, very broadly, the German legislation is easily applicable here. All the Germans did was take international standards to which Canada is a signatory. They didn't reinvent the wheel. They implemented obligations which are fairly simple. I referred to some of them in my introduction. Risk management, risk analysis, a statement of principles, reports that are required, but also a whole process of controlling and sanctioning. The Federal Tax Department has to check reports every year. There's visiting the institutions. There's investigative powers. They can order certain things. Fines can go up to 8 million euros. So we're not talking about $250,000. We're talking about 8 million euros. That can hurt. As well as other sorts of sanctions and penalties. So I think that we can look to that law for inspiration if we want things to move forward. We can also do it progressively. We can say that companies of a certain size, with certain sales volume, with certain cross-border international assets, but we could also participate in the UN work in this area where we never do anything since 2014, and yet China's going to those meetings, and we don't. And if you don't go, of course, then you're wrong. Ms. Murphy, do you have anything to add?
I'll just add that there are other pieces of legislation that I think the Canadian government could benefit from on this subject. One is a disclosure of customs records so that people can actually see what is coming into Canada and to know what imports are making it to the shelves. This has been an important tool for advocacy groups and for researchers to understand what it is we're buying and what it is we're investing in.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, Dr. Murphy, we're out of time for Mr. Bolaris. We will now welcome back to the committee Mr. Genuis for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Toti, I didn't want to miss the opportunity while you're here to ask for your reflections on what seem to be some very exciting developments inside of China. We're seeing unprecedented in decades protesters in various cities across China standing up and speaking out against injustices, some of whom are directly calling for an end to President Xi's regime. These events have really been sparked by events in Urumqi, and so are we seeing a kind of common cause being made between Uyghurs and their Chinese neighbors? And what are your reflections on the significance and impact of these protests for China in general and for Uyghurs in particular?
Thank you for this question. Unfortunately, the death of 44 Uyghurs, not 10, that sparked a whole range of anger and uprising, I can say, whole China, more than 101 cities and 50 universities. People participated, people took on the streets, and some of them openly said, 解放 Xinjiang, liberate Xinjiang, or open up Xinjiang. That kind of slogan and support the Uyghur people. And the anger here is mostly motivated by the Xi Jinping's the more than 100 days lockdown without giving any access to basic necessity and the food and the medical supply. And in this perspective, Uyghurs and Han Chinese, they share the same suffer. And for that reason, that became a point for motivation. And also, this tragic incident helped to connect a certain level of solidarity, and which we can see inside China and outside China, and we are participating. The Chinese people led the memorials across the cities, and for that reason, that understanding is, in my opinion, it is very important, and it should continue. And the Chinese people, this side, not only angered their reaction about the COVID lockdown. At the same time, they directed their anger directly to Chinese President Xi Jinping and the Communist Party. And the most common slogan is "Gongsan Dang Xiate, Xi Jinping Xiate," which means down with Xi Jinping, down with Communist Party. I think it is important.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for sharing your perspective on that. I think this is very significant and inspiring, and I want to just share my strong support for the people that are protesting in their calls for freedom, for justice, for protection of their fundamental human rights. And obviously, a tragic incident sparked this. I think it is quite significant that we see how the deaths of Uyghurs have sparked this protest movement, which includes people all across China. Very, very significant. I want to ask about having a more coordinated approach among like-minded allies when it comes to both preventing the importation of products made from forced labor and also trying to prevent investment in companies that are involved in forced labor. Professor Murphy made the point that products are likely to end up in the countries that have the weakest laws, and maybe the same is true for investment, that we see investment from countries with the weakest laws. So with that in mind, wouldn't it make sense for a group of like-minded countries to get together and say, we are going to have the same rules in place, we're going to have a coordinated approach, we're going to have the same standards, and wouldn't that actually make it a lot easier for enforcement as well as a lot easier for businesses, that they would be able to apply one standard across all the countries that they operate in, and no country would be providing safe haven. Does that coordinated approach make sense, and why hasn't it happened? Maybe Professor Murphy, we'll start with you, and I have very little time, but we'll try to get as many people in as we can.
Sure. I'll say that this kind of multilateral approach, I've been hearing this call for a multilateral approach from American government officials for 2 years now, and I don't know what it is that stops other countries from doing it, except for that they are anxious about their relationship to China and their trade relationship in particular. I hear many countries say we are a small country, and therefore, or we are small relative to China, and therefore we can't sort of poke the bear. But I do think that since the U.S. has led on this, it's possible to sort of to follow their momentum. But I also think that when we think about multilateral strategies, we should also think about the way small and medium enterprises can do the same by following the lead of big enterprises. I don't think we need to say that only large investment firms or large companies should be held to standards of having good human rights due diligence. We know that small companies are purchasing directly from Xinjiang. We know that small investment firms have their money in those companies. And what we need is to see a situation where these larger contenders take that step and do the work and do the due diligence and stand up and support the smaller businesses. And if we want to call them smaller countries, I don't like that idea. Countries are countries, and they all have a standing in the UN and in other international bodies to stand up against this kind of human rights violations. And I think Canada needs.
Thank you, Mr. Genuis. I'm sorry you are out of time. We will now go to Mr. Frangis-Gatos for 5 minutes or less.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Professor Dufour, your comment about Germany's law is very interesting. I have a question about administrative issues. Is the administration of this legislation very difficult, yes or no?
C'est difficile à répondre.
It's hard to answer that question because the German law is only going to come into force on January the 1st. But I can tell you that based on what we know with respect to the French law, which has been in force since 2017, it is difficult to implement. Most companies, for the time being, have not been able to correctly implement the act. Organizations did studies and analyses, they've made proposals, and France is revising the issue. It's difficult. These are challenges. They're challenges for business, they're challenges for administrations and governments. That's all I can tell you for now. Thank you. Why is it such a challenge in France or elsewhere?
C'est évident.
Well, clearly, it's difficult for businesses to really track the entire supply chain. And so the companies that are of a certain size tend to be the ones that are constrained by these obligations because they have to conduct audits. They have to have a lot of information on their suppliers because it's the entire supply chain that's being targeted, even when it's abroad. So that can be difficult. And we realize that companies don't have the right tools to be able to do this kind of tracking. We know that today you can have all kinds of parts from several different countries and several different companies in one actual finished product. And often you could subcontract to a company that subcontracts to another company that subcontracts the subcontract. So it's difficult to really track everything realistically. However, we have to begin somewhere. And by having normative frameworks that are clear and specific as well as ambitious, we can do that. Thank you. A very general question, but I think an important one. What is your key recommendation for our committee? One recommendation, very key. Do what's necessary so that Canada has very severe normative frameworks for respecting human rights and environmental law for these companies all along the supply chain. Because we talked about investment funds who invest abroad, but we also invest in our Canadian companies who participate directly or indirectly in violations of human and environmental law occurring abroad. So Canada must pass a very general law on the duty of vigilance for business. Thank you very much.
To Professor Murphy, do you think, Professor, there are ways for Canada to collaborate with middle powers through international forums to achieve precisely some of the outcomes that all of you have been calling for tonight? Because on its own, I'm not sure that even if Canada put in the most robust kind of law, on its own, I'm not sure that it would have much effect, to be frank. But in collaboration with other countries, perhaps it is possible to have an effect. I'm thinking in terms of efficacy. My question before referred to challenges in administration. I don't mean to throw cold water on the ideas. I think there are immense challenges in putting such measures in place to begin with, but maybe it's worth exploring the issue from another avenue, and that is to what extent we can collaborate with other countries so that uniformity in terms of a legal approach is achieved. What do you think?
I think that kind of multilateral approach is critical because, as I said before, the countries that do not have this kind of legislation are going to be the companies that are the dumping grounds for the products made through human rights violations. And by not tracing our supply chains entirely all the way to the raw materials, we make it possible for governments like the Chinese government, authoritarian governments, to hold our supply chains captive. And what that leads to is a lack of competitiveness in the market. It leads to an inability to extract ourselves when there are crises and when there are, other kinds of supply chain crises as well. And so this universal standard of holding companies accountable for knowing where their goods come from addresses a lot of problems that go to food security, national security. These are all things that we need to be thinking about. And so I do think this needs to be a standard with allies, nations.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Murphy. Mr. Fragaskatos. We'll now go to Mr. Bergeron for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Toti, when we were interrupted a few minutes ago, you were about to tell us what the impacts there would be on possible impacts in Canada and Quebec's savers on a potential invasion of Taiwan. I would like to hear the rest of your answer.
And the many the witnesses already testified in this room, and all of them just agreed that Xi Jinping is unpredictable, and the uncertainty is certainty in China right now. And there are a lot of military activities going on in Taiwan Strait for reason. And also there, if we look at carefully the closing remark of the Chinese President Xi Jinping in recent 20th Communist Party Congress, and it is totally different, drastically different than his traditional comment on China. And the previous the presidents, all of them said the unification, peaceful unification of motherland with Taiwan is the goal. But this time, the Chinese president said all option is on the table. That is in his the closing speech. That tells you something. And the Chinese president twice ordered for full preparation, the Chinese military for full preparation for war. That is for a reason. And we have to take those, the threats or messages seriously. And if that thing to happen, what's going to happen for our investment? We have nearly $100 billion investments in China, from Canadian pension fund, provincial pension fund, university endowments, and the community investments. And so it is going to be wiped out. Either Chinese government is going to block the exit of these funds, or because of the sanction, the share prices drops down, as was the case in Russia, and our the invested funds just wiped out. There is a great danger, and because of that geopolitical risk, the huge risk, and our pension funds should take action and withdraw their investments from China.
Thank you, Mr. Bergeron. We'll now go to Mr. Bulleris for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, merci énormément, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. As defenders of human rights and a democracy, we are here to defend everybody's rights, whether they're the rights of Ukrainians or Uyghurs, Tibetans, people in Hong Kong, but also Palestinians who are also experiencing military occupation. And we would often like to know whether the products were made in illegal colonies condemned by UN resolutions. Ms. Murphy, I would like to hear you on how we can find what products were manufactured in Xinjiang, likely by forced labor camps, when it's already hard to find out what products were made in illegal Israeli colonies.
The work I do every day is to trace supply chains back to the Uyghur region. We start with companies in the Uyghur region and we see who they say they're selling to. And we are able to see full supply chains that reach from the Uyghur region out to the US, Canada, UK, EU. We use often just simple searches of the records, the corporate records of companies operating in the Uyghur region, where they announce clearly, both in their annual reports and in their PR releases and their social media, the big contracts that they have won with international corporations or Chinese corporations operating internationally. We then trace those companies to who they're selling through customs records that are available for 19 countries, though not available for Canada. And that's significant. And so we're able to do it from our desks on the internet with a paid subscription for a program that costs $7,000. That's it. And so I think that not only can governments do it, but companies can and must do it. And we need to stop making excuses for it. I do it every day.
Et très rapidement, si je peux me permettre une autre...
Very briefly, if I may ask another question. What about our pension funds and our investment funds, whether they're public or private? Should they be paying more attention?
Absolutely. And, pension funds and investment funds can start by just looking at their investments and comparing them against lists that are publicly available. Jewish World Watch has a list of all companies that have been named in any report. Some of those companies will be famous international brands that are way down the supply chain, but the Jewish World Watch database shows you where in the supply chain they are and what their connection is to the Uyghur region. Investment funds, both active and passive, should be comparing their investments against those lists. And what it's, if it's going to take people who have those pensions doing that work for them and calling them to account, well, we're all here saying that we're doing it. It's time that the government says that the
Oh, dear. I think, Ms. Murphy, I'm sorry, you froze up there for a second, but we are out of time. So it is time to release you at what must be after 2:30 in the morning your time. And we very much appreciate your presence here, as do we appreciate Dr. Dufour, Mr. Tohi, and Mr. Mazimov. Thank you both for being here. We will now pause while we get our third and final panel ready to go. And I'd like to welcome the witnesses that are joining us by video conference today. As an individual, Sam Goodman, author, Director of Policy and Advocacy, Hong Kong Watch, and co-founder and co-chair of New Diplomacy UK. And from Hong Kong Watch, Aileen Calverley, co-founder and trustee. Mr. Goodman, you'll have 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you. I would like to thank members of this committee for inviting me
Point
here
d'ordre, Monsieur le Président.
to give.
Point of order, Chair.
Je veux simplement m'assurer.
I just want to be sure that the sound checks have been conducted.
Tested.
Merci.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Goodman, you may start again. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to thank members of this committee for inviting me here to give evidence today. I sincerely hope that this inquiry can be part of a more honest conversation about the very real risks for ordinary Canadians of their pension funds being invested in Chinese stocks and government bonds. These risks are far too often ignored in the pursuit of short-term gains, with too many fund managers distracted by the allure of China's financial markets and the myth that China is too much of an economic opportunity to ignore. Research Hong Kong Watch has undertaken over the last 18 months into Canadian pension funds has warned that some of Canada's largest publicly controlled pension funds may have exposure to Chinese companies that are involved with human rights violations in the Xinjiang region. A year ago, we found that the Canadian Pension Plan Investment Board and provincial pension funds like CDPQ in Quebec and BCI in British Columbia had direct holdings in Chinese technology companies blacklisted by the US for their links to internment camps in Xinjiang, and other large technology companies complicit in oppression in China, including Alibaba and Tencent. I'm happy to say that many of these funds have divested most of these direct holdings, but some remain passively exposed to index tracking funds such as MSCI China and MSCI Emerging Markets that hold 12 companies and 13 companies respectively that are linked to Uyghur forced labor. In the case of CPPIB, its most recent holdings published on the 31st of March 2022 confirmed that it had $6.4 billion exposed to MSCI China and $7.7 billion exposed to MSCI Emerging Markets, while the Royal Bank of Canada, through its partnership with BlackRock, is offering pension fund products directly to the Canadian public, which track MSCI Emerging Markets Index. Sadly, the current information these funds provide publicly is far too opaque for the ordinary lawmaker, let alone the ordinary Canadian citizen, to have a proper understanding of their pension funds' exposure to China. Most of the provincial and federal pension funds I've looked at do not publish a regular and up-to-date list of their full holdings. In some cases, the holdings listed are out of date by a year. The other issue regularly encountered includes pension funds outsourcing their fund management to private fund managers and private equity firms, which in effect outsources human rights and governance due diligence to third parties. Now, it may not be sexy, but there is an urgent need to require Canadian pension funds to regularly publish their full holdings publicly, the holdings of their private fund managers, and their passive exposure to index funds like MSCI. More broadly, I believe investing in China is increasingly incompatible with upholding environmental, social, and governance criteria, which all major pension funds in Canada claim they do. Over the past few years, rising investment in Chinese stocks and bonds has coincided with a boom in ESG investing. According to Bloomberg, ESG assets surpassed $35 trillion in 2020 to become a third of total global assets under management. Yet many have now concluded that investing in Chinese stocks and bonds is incompatible with ESG, including leading figures in the investment community like George Soros and Baroness Helena Kennedy. Taking their E in ESG, climate activists have long argued that investment in Chinese state companies like Sinopec, who stand accused in some cases of producing higher levels of carbon emissions than some entire developed countries, can hardly be considered beneficial to the environment. When it comes to the S in ESG, human rights groups like Hong Kong Watch have warned investors about the rising social risks of investing in Chinese companies linked to forced labor, or larger technology companies like Alibaba and Tencent, who are working hand in glove with the Chinese state to surveil the populace and censor the internet. Looking at the G in ESG, Xi Jinping's crackdown last year on the technology and education sector and Putin's war in Ukraine have raised legitimate governance risks in a country where there is no separation between private enterprise and the state, where one man can wipe out whole industries at the flick of a pen. The purging of reformers from the Central Committee at the recent party congress and the doubling down on zero COVID policies only increases the governance risks of investing in China and has led to the mass protests we are currently witnessing across China. I believe it is well past time that lawmakers consider sensible regulations to define ESG, to label China as an ESG risk, and to introduce a blacklist like the USA to restrict investment in Chinese firms with questionable human rights, environmental, and governance credentials. Finally, I urge the committee to invite pension funds to give evidence and explain why they are so happy to operate under a smokescreen that deprives the Canadian people of the opportunity to fully understand where their pensions are being invested and the real risks involved. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Goodman. Before we get to questions, I'll ask you to move your microphone boom up just sort of halfway between your upper lip and your nose. That'll be just perfect. Thank you. We'll now go to Ms. Calverley for her opening statement of 5 minutes or less.
Thanks for the committee for giving me this opportunity to talk about Canada's pension funds investment in Chinese equity. I want to raise a wider issue for the Canada's pension funds and other institutional investors. By holding Chinese stocks of any kind, investors are taking on China country risk. China has become a big part of the international indices. At the end of October, the MSCI Global Emerging Market Index was about 27% in Chinese stocks. Canadian pension funds invest directly in Chinese stocks, not just in passive index funds. Up until March this year, CPPIB held 189 Chinese stocks. Chinese stocks have in fact performed very badly in recent years because of all the problems in the economy. But China's country risk has also become increasingly political. Many international investors are worried about geopolitical risk, especially after what happened when Russia invaded Ukraine. In February, international investors found their holdings in Russian stock frozen due to international sanctions and Russian actions. Russia does not allow foreigners to buy or sell stocks or to exchange rubles for dollars. So investment in Russia are frozen. Many investors have realized big losses. BlackRock alone lost 17 billion of its investors' money. Another example in an MSCI Russia fund traded in the US, which invests only in Russian stocks, it is currently being liquidated, having lost 99.8% of its value this year. What if that were to happen with Chinese stocks? Relationship between the US and China have become more difficult in the last few years, with several potential flashpoints. Taiwan is the biggest one, but there are several other disputed territories in the Indo-Pacific region, which could trigger a conflict between the US and China. If a confrontation occurs, there are various scenarios ranging from limited sanctions being placed on China to actual war between the US and China. In any of these scenarios, Canadian investment in China could be at risk. The US defense chief have warned that China could invade Taiwan in coming years. And there is speculation that Xi Jinping wants the so-called recovery of Taiwan to be part of his legacy. If China were to attempt an invasion of Taiwan, there is a strong chance that the US could respond. President Biden has said that America would act. But for sure, we will see sanctions. Such a sanction could see retaliation by China against foreign investors. Many people believe that China would not risk such an attack, or at least not for some years. But China may have other options to put pressure on Taiwan, such as a trade blockade. A recent report by the US State Department has warned that a China blockade of Taiwan could spark $2.5 trillion in annual economic losses to the global economy. To put this into perspective, this would be larger than the global economic loss in 2008 financial crisis, which cost the economy $2 trillion. Again, Western sanctions are a real possibility if this was to try, with the potential for Chinese action against foreign investor, which damage Canadian pension. Another potential trigger for Western sanction could be if China clamped down on dissent in the country. This week, there have been protests in China over the COVID lockdowns. If these escalate further, or any issue arises in coming months or years, a heavy-handed response, something like the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989, could see a Western response. It's worth bearing in mind that a conflict between the US and China at any level would likely see stock market falling everywhere. So pension assets would likely be down across the board, potentially threatening the payment of pensions. Canadian pension fund could face total loss on their investment in China. This is a major potential problem for the Canadian government. Imposing sanctions could force losses on government pension funds. So I have two recommendations. Number one, country risk analysis. We need to know more about the size of pension fund investment in China, how they are monitored, managed, and whether investment managers fully understand the risk they are taking. Is there any regulation on disclosure? A country risk analysis should be included in Indo-Pacific strategy. Secondly, publicly controlled pension funds should be encouraged to avoid exposure in China. In terms of fund tracker, there are several funds covering emerging markets, excluding China, or Asia emerging market excluding China. So there is no need to hold Chinese stock just to get broad emerging market exposure. In conclusion, I will urge the committee to recognize the increasing country risk associated with investment in China and plan accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Calverley. I appreciate the input. So we will now go to our first round of questions and to Ms. Dancho for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here. I greatly appreciated your opening remarks. I just want to dig in a little bit to some of the things that you shared with the committee. They seem, they're quite shocking for someone who perhaps doesn't understand how Canada's pension funds are invested in various industries and in different countries around the world. But given what we're learning about how China treats the Uyghurs, we just had a panel with testimony on that right before you, and what they've done to Hong Kong, which you know extremely well, much better than I, and the threats sort of that they've been really talking about Taiwan as well. If you could just explain a little bit in a little bit more detail, to what extent is Canada's pension funds invested in Chinese companies in China? Is it all of our pension funds? Is it a vast majority of our Canadian pension, for example? Can you just elaborate a little bit more? Whoever would like to go first.
Yeah, I mean, I think it will be a heavy weighting of pension funds that are looking at emerging markets. And often the way that pensions are sort of banded together, obviously when you're younger, I guess I'm not that young, but kind of youngish, more of your pension will go to emerging markets funds because in theory you'll get a higher return, but there's also a higher risk. And then obviously that should be phased out as you get closer to retirement age. And I think the problem that Ms. Calverley's sort of surmised very well is that a lot of the emerging market funds are heavily weighted to China to a point where some of these funds might have a third of stocks in China, in government bonds and in equities. And that's just too high a risk, really. But it does vary from pension fund to pension fund. And I think, it goes to the point that I was trying to make, that I don't think a lot of these pension funds are being honest about the holdings that they have in China because they're not properly publicly disclosing them.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And yes, Ms. Calverley, pardon me, am I pronouncing your last name right? It's Calverley. Calverley. Thank you very much. You spoke to specifically that this is puts our pension funds in danger. You said you sort of tied it to if China invades Taiwan and the U.S. responds, that throws sort of everything that's been invested in China into it could throw it into disarray, could threaten the stability of our pension funds. I see nodding for Mr. Goodman. Can Can you just confirm that what I relayed to you, is that correct in my meaning, what you've said?
Yes, the situation actually very serious. Well, I think talking about a war between the U.S. and China and Taiwan, that's very the worst scenario. But I think like even without that, even a trade blockade, that will be huge blow to the world economy and also our pension fund. Because in a blockade, that will hurt the supply chain, for example, from Taiwan and China, and also the trade finance. I think a lot of time we only talk about goods, but we forget about the finance behind the trade. So when something happens like that, even the finance will stop because we can see the situation in Russia. If we're talking about outright war, that will be very serious. I will see Chinese stocks actually wiped out, especially the same as the situation in Russia. So I want to go back to your first question. Actually, there are many pension funds in Canada. Actually, they got holding in emerging market funds. So 27% of emerging market fund actually invest in China. And also they possibly have investment in individual stocks as well. I can give you some lists, actually very, very long list. I don't want to use a lot of time. So of course, the Canadian Pension Plan Investment Board, Alberta Investment Management Corporation, Civic Service Superannuity Board of Manitoba, the public sector pension investment, so British Columbia Investment, Investment Management Corporation of Ontario. So it's a very, very long list. I think very important that that should be a regulation that pension fund need to have disclosure. Because we have done research, looked into the holdings, but a lot of them, they did not show it. So like I can find the Canadian Pension Fund, Pension Plans Investment Board, they show the stock holdings. Mm-hmm. So I find 189 Chinese stock, the second largest holding after the US stocks. Wow. That is striking.
And so, if I may just interject with our remaining minute, thank you for outlining that. And so the pension funds you mentioned are a number of provincial government pension funds and the federal government, well, the national pension that we all pay into, whether you work for the government or not. But certainly the provincial ones were the provincial government funds. So I'm wondering, the federal government recently put out their Indo-Pacific strategy, as I'm sure you are aware, and they really emphasized the importance of pursuing Canada's values in our foreign affairs in this region. And so from what you've shared, though, and what this committee knows very well, what's going on with China and what they're doing to their people and the like, would you say that, I mean, you're saying that we should restrict Canada's investment of our pensions in China. I think that those two, what we're seeing in the Indo-Pacific strategy about values and the government wanting to pursue those values doesn't seem to line up, to your point, with how we invest our government pensions. So with my remaining time, I'm just open the floor back up to you, Mr. Goodman, and then Ms. Calvary as well, just to sort of comment. How can we align our strategy with where we're putting our money, I suppose? I'm going to have to ask both of our witnesses to maybe work some of that messaging into some of their answers to subsequent questions, because Ms. Stancho, you are out of time. We'd like to go to Ms. Yip now for 6 minutes or less.
Well, I'd like to hear the answer to Ms. Danko's comments.
I mean, I would start by saying that these pension funds actually should already be doing, investing really on the basis of Canadian values, because that was the whole point behind the ESG criteria, right? Upholding, the climate, upholding, human rights and social values, upholding good governance and the rule of law. And the reality is that they're not doing that because ESG just isn't properly regulated. I think a lot of the pension fund managers don't take it seriously. They consider it just to be a vehicle to make more money. And that is why I think ultimately you need proper legislation, regulation that defines clearly what the ESG criteria is and holds these Canadian pension funds to task when it comes to some of the investments that don't meet that criteria, particularly in China.
I think it's I think must be very shocking because I think like often we hear that, oh, there's supply chain and there's like cotton actually made by, Uyghur and they're in concentration camp. But we never look into our pension. So like, I think politicians or this committee work very hard to defend our values, defend Canada's values, and also defend human rights. But I think investors, especially fund manager, they're very busy investing in China. They don't need to go there. They just need to buy the stocks. They just buy the bonds. Okay, so like Canadian Pension Plan Investment Board is huge. So it's really related to our payment, our pension. So when you open and look into their stock holdings, 189 Chinese stocks, the second largest holding after the US stocks. So that is quite striking. Of course, like when we talk about ESG, so for the S, so we single out quite a long list of company which violate of human rights, and Canada's pension fund should not invest in this company. But then when we look into the Indo-Pacific strategy, we need to be prepared. We need to have a contingency plan. When something happened in Taiwan, even not a war, even just a blockade or some kind of disputes in South China Sea, or even because of the crackdown of protests in China, and then the pro-democracy, like-minded country put sanction on China, then what happened to Chinese stocks and Chinese bonds? Definitely they will collapse. And then we will see our pension fund, lose value. So I think this is the area that I think the committee need to push the government. They need to have a proper country risk analysis. I think like the government need to work on that. So what's the risk when some kind of confrontation in Indo-Pacific region? Will that affect our pension? And also like what sort of regulation we should have under the risk, under this special risk? I think like 2-3 years ago, nobody would think about that. And at that time, it was quite fashionable to invest in China. I think like 2-3 years ago, the return was one of the highest. But then when you look at the average of return for Chinese stock for the last 2 decades, it's almost zero because of it collapsed so much for the last year. So it's not the best place to put our investment in the Chinese market.
So,
and also, yeah.
Oh, okay. I was just going to ask, so how can ordinary investors, just regular Canadians, keep track of which companies are problematic?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where, and some of the witnesses earlier mentioned, this is where a blacklist would come into play. And I actually think, to be honest, it's not a negative concept, actually. Some of the investors we speak to think a blacklist would be very helpful for them. It would be a sort of roadmap of the companies to avoid. But I do think there's a general larger problem when it comes to ESG in China, where I think in all conscience, you probably can't invest in most Chinese stocks without there being some level of risk. Now, of course, there are going to be private investors who are happy to wear that risk and go in with their eyes open, which is fine. But I think the issue that we're talking about today is, gambling with other people's money, and gambling with Canadian pensioners' money. And I think at that point, the aversion to risk should be quite low.
I think for ESG, investment is quite fashionable right now. So actually, we can buy ESG fund, but the problem is they focus on E only. So when you buy ESG fund, usually environmental friendly, so you don't get this oil company or any company create pollution bad to the environment, or you don't have tobacco company. But I don't really see many ESG funds actually looking at the S and G. So I think like if there's some kind of encouragement to fund management So they possibly will come up with more ESG fund and focus on the S. So then in the fund, they will have a list of companies that they will not invest in, like they did not invest in tobacco company or oil company.
All right, Ms. Calvary, thank you for that. Ms. Yip, you are out of time. We will now turn to Mr. Bergeron for 6 minutes or less.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci à nos...
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to our witnesses. Mr. Goodman, I'd like to get back to that notion of a blacklist. Some companies and some investment funds and pension funds, some witnesses on the previous panels were telling us that pension plans and investment funds say that they're not investing in the Chinese government, but rather in Chinese companies. And according to these witnesses, it's a fallacious argument because Chinese companies are government-owned and must answer to the government's directives. Would it be simpler to simply say on this blacklist that you should not invest in any Chinese company at all?
I mean, I think it would certainly be simpler, although there might be an argument that for some sectors of the Chinese economy, investments would be low risk, perhaps investing in a food company, perhaps investing in real estate. But I certainly take the point that when it comes to other sectors, say agriculture, technology, the fashion industry, they're so exposed to forced labor. There's no distinction, as you've pointed out, between private companies and the government. Therefore, I certainly think that you probably wouldn't or you shouldn't countenance investing in Chinese companies in those sectors of the economy.
Dans le rapport de Novembre...
In the November 2022 report, of which you were one of the co-authors, which is called Passively Funding Crimes Against Humanity, How Your Savings May Be Financing Internment Camps and Forced Labor in China, you were commenting on the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which prohibits importing into the United States products extracted from or made in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. And it says that this law does not require the Uyghur Independent Area to be covered. You recommend that Decree 032 in the States was noteworthy. I find it interesting because the Canadian government proceeded differently. We proceeded by decree to prevent the entry into Canada of products manufactured in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, probably through forced labor. The problem is that we are not in a position to implement this order. And of course, there's not a question of investment in the autonomous region. We're just talking about forbidding entry into Canada of products made in the Xinjiang region, probably thanks to forced labor. But we do not prohibit investing in the companies who will produce goods which will be exported. If we don't import them here, they'll be exported elsewhere. Isn't there a contradiction there? And then I'll come back to what you were proposing with respect to 14032.
Yeah, I certainly think there needs to be parity when it comes to legislation, looking at supply chains. They should also look at finance. I think you're right. We can't really talk about banning the sort of import of goods from Xinjiang, while at the same time we allow the financing of companies that have direct links to forced labor in Xinjiang. There is a clear inconsistency.
Conséquemment, ce que vous nous dites, c'est que...
So consequently, what you're saying is that it is not sufficient to prohibit the entry into our territory of products manufactured in the Xinjiang Autonomous Region, probably via forced labor. We have to prohibit investment which contribute to production of these goods, which, if they aren't exported to us because of this prohibition, they would be exported elsewhere in the world.
Yeah, I think I would support that recommendation.
Donc, je reviens à la...
So I come back to one of the conclusions of your report of November 2022. You point out that the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act does not prohibit investment in Uyghur Autonomous Region companies, but that it would be possible to implement such a prohibition through Decree 14032. Could you tell us more about that, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think the regime that the US government is setting up would allow a provision that could apply to investment as well as goods. And I think it might be a good example of something that Canada might be able to replicate as well. And I recognize that the approach that the Americans have taken is quite aggressive. It recognizes that there simply isn't a test to meet for due diligence as well, that you can't verify a lot of the times whether goods are being made by forced labor. And I think similar tests could apply in some cases to investment, where I think there's a sizable amount of evidence linking some of the companies in the region to the camps and to some of the forced labor programs.
Thank you, Mr. Bergeron. Mr. Goodman, one more microphone adjustment. If you could move your microphone out a little bit, just bend it out a little bit. But again, between your nose and your lip, that would be good. Yeah, we're just getting a little pee popping. And for the benefit of our translators, we want to make sure that the sound is not distorted. Thank you. Now, we will go to Mr. Bulleris for 6 minutes or less.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thanks to witnesses and experts for being with us this evening.
Calverley, si vous voulez intervenir également.
We have to Mr. Goodman, did you get that translation?
No.
No, I'm sorry. We, for some reason, the translation was not. Maybe pushed the wrong button. Let's, Mr. Bulleris, could you just very briefly repeat your question?
Oui, ma question était...
Yes, my question was related to the fact that Mr. Goodman previously had indicated that, according to him, the ESG criteria were not really taken seriously, didn't really have any true application, and were almost a joke. They weren't particularly serious, and that's of grave concern to me. And I have the impression that the translation is working now, so I'd like to hear what he has to say about that, and I would also like to hear from Ms. Calverley afterwards on the same subject.
So, I mean, the process with ESG is that if there is a company that's suspected of forced labor or involvement in forced labor, as an example, a Canadian pension fund would be expected to engage with that company to see how they could improve their record on forced labor, which, within the context of China and the Chinese state apparatus is kind of a non-starter, really. That process won't go anywhere because, as other witnesses have pointed out, these companies are working hand in glove with the Chinese state, and they're legally required by Chinese laws to do so. So the process itself is quite flawed. And I think increasingly for a lot of pension funds, it's become a bit of a tick box exercise. And as Ms. Calverley has already pointed out, it's heavily slanted towards focusing mainly on the environment and forgetting about human rights.
Yeah, I think for example, for the Canadian pension plan, we can see that Alibaba and Tencent, actually a huge holding there, one of the biggest holding in that pension plan. both actually, with violation of human rights in Xinjiang. So I don't know what the pension plans, do they have any mandate? They need to, check their holding, whether it's comply with ESG. I'm not sure that actually is a mandate, right? So I think a lot of fund manager now is quite fashionable to check ESG, but I think there's no authority. Or, for example, for country risk rating agency, we get S&P and Moody, right, for rating. But for company, we never get any ESG rating. For example, it's like, it raised 10, that means it's very good. Number 1 is bad violation of environment or human rights. We don't have that kind of rating. We only have rating for risk. So we get Moody and S&P to give rating, for example, Canada's country bonds, our bonds, actually AAA, for example. So you get that kind of rating. But for stocks, we don't have that kind of rating yet. So it's really up to our fund manager to make the decision, especially if there's no regulation that our pension fund must follow this sort of ESG standard.
Merci beaucoup, vous deux. Puis...
Thank you very much to both of you. I've just come back from COP27 in Egypt, so I'm aware of the greenwashing concept. Are we seeing with ESG essentially labor washing or human rights washing? How could the Canadian government ensure that this principle really apply more and not simply a tick box?
I think you have to mandate that all the components of ESG have equal weighting, and that includes the S as well as the E and the G. I also think, in terms of social risks and social factors, often companies think of gender diversity on their board. Do they celebrate LGBTQ plus month, things like this, while they neglect basic human rights? And I think if you were to require companies to take human rights seriously, it would probably transform the emerging markets index overnight, because, of course, China is not the only one that has human rights issues. There are many countries and there are many companies that are involved with the states that have appalling human rights records.
Canada is a leading country defending human rights and freedom in the world. So I think actually Canada can lead on ESG standard. So like if the government gets serious about our pensions, our investment, so I think that should be the starting point, that we impose some kind of regulation that our pension plan need to look into ESG standard. So that will be a very good start and a good example, a good model to other countries in the world. And I'm sure Canada can do this.
Mr. Bulleris, you are out of time. I did stop the clock, by the way, so that you could repeat your question. We will now go to Mr. Chong for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll split my time with Mr. Genuis, if that's okay with you. Mr. Chair, there have been consultations among the various members of the committee, and if you seek it, I believe you will find unanimous consent to adopt the following motion. That the chair be directed to present the following to the House forthwith. That the committee express its support for the brave and courageous Chinese protesters who are fighting for their fundamental human rights and freedoms of association and expression, and call on Beijing to respect the right to peaceful assembly and avoid a repeat of the Tiananmen Square massacre of 5 June 1989, and request the government respond to this report under Standing Order 109.
Does Mr. Chong have unanimous consent to present this motion? Agreed. So agreed. Do we need a recorded division, or are we willing to just all say yes? Yes. We are all willing to say yes, Mr. Chong. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chong. And Sam, Eileen, it's great to see you both. Thank you for your presence here, but more importantly, thank you for your work on such a vital issue. I think it's important to underline that this issue of products being imported into Canada made from slave labor, of Canadian pension dollars and other dollars from Canada being invested in companies that are part of repression inside of China. Fundamentally, this is not a new issue. This is an issue that both of you have been working on, have been sounding the alarm on for years, that we've discussed it in Parliament, various committees. I pulled up a question from my friend, Mr. Kemich, who's sitting beside me here, a question from 2019, where he asked the government specifically about CPP-IB investments in companies that are complicit in crimes related to the Uyghur genocide. So this was 3.5 years ago. At least that we were raising these issues in Parliament, and I think the extent, the horrors of the situation called then and call now for an ambitious action plan from the government. And yet we've continued to talk about it, and we hear some of the right words from government members. But the fact is, we haven't seen any kind of action or action plan around this. We've talked a bit about Bill S-211. That's a private member's bill. It's proposed by an independent senator, championed by various members, and sponsored by a backbench member of the governing party. But we haven't seen any kind of government legislation, any kind of efforts to negotiate new international agreements or substantive proposals from the government. So there's really been a lack of response, a lack of ambition in trying to address this very, very significant problem. So it's great that you're here. It's great that we're talking about this. But I think it's far past time that the government took some action on this. When it comes to CPP-IB specifically, the response to my honourable friend 3.5 years ago was to say that CPP-IB operates independently at arm's length and that the government trusts its decision making. The response to questions that I've posed to the directors at CPP-IB is we operate under framework legislation, and we're constrained by that framework legislation, and that defines the factors we should or shouldn't take into consideration. So there is a bit of a finger pointing both ways going on here. But we desperately need some action. I think that leadership has to start from the government. So maybe if you could comment specifically on what kinds of concrete actions you would like to see the government of Canada to take as soon as possible to address the unacceptable importation of goods involved in slave labor and investment in companies that are involved in this.
We'll ask for a brief response from both people, please.
So I think, first of all, a piece of legislation that mandates a regular blacklist be published for investors restricting investment into China. I think a summary piece of legislation that defines ESG and particularly mandates the CPP-IB to integrate the ESG definition as set out by lawmakers into all of its investments.
And also there should be country risk analysis attached to Indo-Pacific strategy. So I think that is very important to lay out the potential losses when there's conflicts.
Thank you, and I am quite confident that
you are out of time,
Mr. Chair. I had been timing, but anyways, I'll defer to you. But I don't think I quite was.
How about I give you 10 seconds?
I think there would be support among at least a majority of parties in the House for some kind of legislation that would establish certain moral guardrails when it comes to CPP-IB investments, and I'd love to see that legislation.
Thank you very much. Mr. Fragaskatos, 5 minutes-ish.
I note the ish, Chair. Thank you very much. The question goes to Ms. Calvary first. And thank you to both of you for your presentations. Ms. Calvary, from about 2019 into 2021, the issue of Hong Kong was front and center. It was capturing front page attention in this country and in other countries. But now you'd be lucky to find the issue of Hong Kong covered on page 820, let's say, of the Globe and Mail or other newspapers. Do you worry about that? How do you see that? Certainly, with respect to China, the focus, for obvious reasons, is Taiwan at the moment. But I think there's a danger in that if we, either as parliamentarians or within Canadian society generally, if we lose sight of the importance of the issue of Hong Kong, I think there's something generally lost there as far as Canada's engagement with China is concerned.
I think I worry, and also worry that, of course, like what you said, so people forget about Hong Kong. But I think for the value, the protest cycle, like in 2014, there was a lot of focus and then dies down. And then 2019, it came back 5 years later. I think in between 2016 and 2017, 18, there was no news among media, and parliamentarians hardly talk about that. But that doesn't mean the whole movement destroy. So I think it's just different momentum. And I believe the focus will be back to Hong Kong one day. But I think right now, of course, we also doing a lot to get the attention from the media and also the support from parliamentarians. For example, the LIBOR scheme helping those who need to escape the repression from Hong Kong. So that's area we are working on. And we got a bit of pieces about the LIBOR scheme from the media, for example, Toronto Star and Global Mail. But of course, yeah, I agree with you. I think like to talk about Hong Kong the last year, possibly we get 4 to 6 pieces of news about Hong Kong.
Thank you very much. With my last question to Mr. Goodman, we heard in the previous panel, sir, and I'm not sure if you were able to follow it, but we heard from a witness that Germany offers the most progressive kind of legislation with respect to supply chains. If you're familiar with the German law, do you have the same point of view?
I'm not aware of the details of the law, but I did hear the previous guest say that the previous witness say that this law will come online next year. I'm not sure how effective that law will be. I guess it will depend on the positioning of the German government. I think if you look at the German government, I was in Berlin 2 weeks ago, they're very divided in this issue of China. And they're having a very active and healthy debate about these investment matters that we've discussed here at the same time. And one of the things that they're looking at is cutting investment incentives for German companies investing in China, which I think is an important issue as well, and something that deserves further consideration from this committee of how it could be replicated in Canada.
Thank you very much. I would offer, I should have specified, but thank you for that, Mr. Goodman. Those are my questions, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Fragascatos. We'll now go to Mr. Bergeron for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Considering the alarm bells that are have been quite visible, the alarm signals have been quite visible for recent months and years, what could lead investment funds and pension funds to want to continue investing in China?
Well, I think the Chinese government is very good at co-opting businessmen who go to China. They're very good at rolling out the red carpet. I think that a lot of investment funds follow some of the big leaders in the field, like BlackRock, who have been, the sounding cry really for further investment in China. In fact, BlackRock, up until last year, were saying that the weighting in the emerging markets was too small and that actually China should have a bigger weighting. And so I think there's a risk where a lot of investors are being sucked up because some of the leading investors are clearly have quite a pro-business sentiment when it comes to China. But I also think that people want to deal with the China that they imagine rather than the China that is the reality. And I think they want, I think at this point in time, we need to realize that Xi Jinping and China and the investment environment in China has fundamentally changed.
So I want to talk about that. I think because like in China or in Hong Kong, if you try to tell the truth about actually there's no return invest in China or the economy actually not good, you will be prosecuted. You could be arrested. You're not allowed to say things like that. So I think often you don't hear the truth. So I think that's the big problem. So I think right now I start to see some article talking about actually there's zero return when you invest in China. I think like if you look at the investment in Chinese stocks for the last 10 years, actually losing money. But somehow I think in the world, the CCP very good at propaganda, telling that it's a wonderful story to invest in China, build your company in China or invest in China, so you get huge return. There's a huge market. So people have that kind of impression. But when you look at the result, you look at the chart, it tells the other story. But a lot of economists or analysts, they are afraid to tell the truth. They don't want to write something bad about China because they could be, in trouble.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bergeron. We'll now go to Mr. Boulris for the final 2.5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I have a question for Ms. Calverley to begin. Because in one of your preceding answers, you talked about the new Canadian Indo-Pacific policy. You said that you wanted to see more on comparative interests. I'm not sure I heard you correctly or I understood you correctly. Could you tell us more about what you think of this new federal government policy regarding our Indo-Pacific strategic interests?
I think especially on China is very progressive. I think more progressive than I expected. It mentioned, defending human rights and defending Canadian values. But I think just saying that is not enough. You need to have a strategy, a plan, how to protect our national interests. I think it did say it wants to protect our national interests, but how? Like when you look at all the pension funds, you're talking about billions of dollars, and we get huge investment in China, right? So in the strategy, it did talk about Taiwan. What happens if there's some conflicts or blockage in Taiwan? What's our plan? Any contingency plan, right? So is there any preparation for such confrontation? Because, for example, even if there's a crackdown on protests, Canada joined other like-minded countries to sanction on China. But then when you sanction on China, Chinese stocks going down, our pension going down. So that means your policy hurting our own pension. But that, we don't want that action to stop, right? So if you worry about our own pension, therefore, oh, no, we are not going to sanction on China. So that's not a very, very good situation to be in. So that's why I think in the Indo-Pacific strategy, especially under the China session, that should be a country risk analysis to estimate the cost of loss when there's a conflict.
Thank you very much, Mr. Boulris. Ms. Calverley, just a quick question from the chair. You've been very outspoken tonight. Do you expect to hear something from China as a result of what you said here?
I don't know, so I don't mind if they want to make comment.
With that, I'll say thank you to both of our witnesses and to our members here tonight. I want to thank our translators, the analysts, the clerk, technical staff, the MP staff who've been with us this evening. We will see you all again next Tuesday evening. This meeting is adjourned.